Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. So, let's go. It was late October, the air crisp and dry as my friends and I drove into the countryside. The plan was simple: stay in an old farmhouse one of us had access to for a night of fun and stories. We packed food, blankets, and flashlights, ready for an evening disconnected from the world. The house stood isolated, surrounded by leafless trees and swaying grass, the perfect setting for a spooky night. The house was old, its walls cracked and faded, and its floors creaked under the weight of our steps. But it had charm, and the electricity worked, which was more than we had hoped for. We explored the place quickly. A single floor, a narrow hallway leading to 3 bedrooms, and a spacious living room with a fireplace. A large mirror hung in the hallway, its surface marred with specks and scratches, giving it an unsettling, cloudy reflection. We settled into the living room as the sun set, laughing and telling silly ghost stories. The mood was light until a faint sound came from the hallway. It was a scraping noise, like fingernails lightly dragging across wood. Everyone went quiet, straining to hear, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it started. We exchanged glances, shrugged it off as the house settling, and went back to our conversation. Minutes later, it came again. This time, louder, a deliberate scrape that seemed to move along the hallway. I grabbed a flashlight and stood up, feeling a mixture of bravery and adrenaline. My friend insisted on coming with me, so together we walked toward the noise. The hallway was dim, the only light coming from the weak bulb overhead. The mirror caught my attention first. I swear I saw something flicker in its reflection, like movement just out of view. My heart thudded in my chest as I shined the flashlight around. Nothing. No sign of anything that could have made the noise. We returned to the group, a little shaken, but determined not to let it ruin the night. It became a joke. We started, teasing each other, making fake ghost noises to lighten the mood. But the tension was palpable, and I could see everyone occasionally glancing toward the hallway. Around midnight, the atmosphere changed. The air felt heavier, like the house was pressing down on us. One of my friends went to use the bathroom, and when he returned, he was pale. He said the mirror in the hallway was fogged up, as if someone had breathed on it. I felt a chill run down my spine. We hadn't touched the mirror, and it wasn't cold enough for condensation. I grabbed my flashlight again, determined to see it for myself. Everyone followed this time, crowding into the narrow hallway. The mirror was indeed fogged. A faint handprint smudged across its surface. The print was elongated, the fingers unnaturally thin and long. We stared at it, frozen. Then the sound came again, the scraping, but this time it was coming from the other end of the hallway. Slowly, we turned. At the far end, a shadow moved. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was tall and angular, its shape wrong in ways I can't describe. It wasn't walking. It was gliding toward us. My friend screamed, and the sound snapped us out of our trance. We ran, piling into the living room, slamming the door behind us. We sat in silence, listening. The scraping sound started again. Now, on the other side of the door. It moved up and down, a deliberate and mocking rhythm. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, not daring to move. Morning came, and with the first light of dawn, we cautiously opened the door. The hallway was empty, the mirror cracked down the middle, the handprint gone. We packed our things and left, swearing never to return. But as we drove away, I glanced in the rear-view mirror. For a split second, I saw it. A face. It started as a simple move to a remote countryside home. My partner, Rachel, and I had been searching for a quiet place to escape the city's noise and find some peace. The house was nestled between hills, surrounded by woods that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. From the outside, it looked charming. white with a steep roof and ivy climbing up its sides. Inside, though, there was an unsettling stillness. Our first night there was calm. Too calm. The house felt old, every creak and groan of the floorboards echoing as if the house itself was watching. Rachel laughed at my nervousness, but something about the atmosphere unsettled me. We set up a few candles and unpacked, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That night, I woke to a faint tapping sound. It was coming from the hallway. Groggy and disoriented, I crept out of bed, stepping quietly over the cold wooden floor. The hallway was dark, except for the faint glow of the moonlight through a nearby window. The tapping grew louder, insistent. When I reached the hallway, I saw the source. A door that had been closed tightly before was now slightly ajar. The room beyond was pitch black. I called out to Rachel, but there was no response. Every part of me screamed to shut the door, but something made me hesitate. The air grew colder, suffocating. Suddenly, a voice whispered just beyond the threshold. "You shouldn't be here." My breath hitched. The voice wasn't human, yet it was unmistakably close. Inside the room, yet coming from nowhere. I slammed the door shut, retreating to our bedroom, shaking. Rachel woke, asking what was wrong, but I couldn't explain it. I barely slept the rest of the night, the whisper lingering in my head. The next day, we decided to explore the house further, hoping to find some logical explanation. The attic was filled with dust-covered furniture, old photographs, and forgotten relics. Among them was another book. This one, thinner, with a leather cover that had been stitched shut. Rachel opened it, and inside were more stories. "Beware the dark corners," it read. "They watch when you think you are alone." We put the book down, uneasy. The atmosphere shifted again, the house feeling heavier, almost oppressive. The sun began to set earlier, casting the house into shadows that seemed to move on their own. That evening, as we sat by the fire, Rachel heard it. A faint whisper again, this time from the far corner of the living room. "You found it," the voice said, slow and deliberate. "It always comes for those who linger." I felt the cold settle in my chest. The fire flickered, but its warmth felt distant. Rachel and I exchanged looks, the unease mounting. Then a sudden bang echoed through the house. Something had slammed shut upstairs. Without thinking, we rushed up, our breaths ragged. The room at the end of the hallway was open again. This time the darkness seemed alive. Shadows writhed on the walls, and that same whisper rose louder, invading our minds. "You've stayed too long." I grabbed Rachel's hand, pulling her back toward the stairs. "We have to get out," I said. The house resisted. Doors slammed behind us, windows darkened, and the whisper grew deafening. We didn't stop. We couldn't. Every step down the stairs felt heavier, like the weight of the house itself pressed against us. At the front door, we froze. It wouldn't budge. That's when we saw it. The shadows, now in the shape of figures, gathered at the base of the stairs. They moved closer, silent and cold. Rachel screamed, and for a moment, I thought we were trapped forever. But then, the house shook violently. The shadows screamed, their voices rising in agony as the walls cracked, splintered, and collapsed. Rachel and I stumbled into the night, gasping for air. Behind us, the house was gone, reduced to rubble and It was a secluded lake house, far from the nearest town, surrounded by dense woods and endless water. The kind of place where cell service failed the moment you crossed the bridge, leaving you completely cut off from the outside world. My friends, and I decided to spend a weekend there, just to get away from everything. No noise, no distractions, just the peaceful sounds of nature. As we approached the cabin, nestled at the water's edge, the trees loomed around us like silent sentinels. The air felt heavier than it should have been, and a strange stillness settled over the area. The usual chirping of birds was absent, replaced by an unsettling silence that made my skin crawl. Inside the cabin, we unpacked and settled in. The place had an odd charm. Old wooden floors that creaked beneath our feet, faded wallpaper, and a fireplace that gave off a flickering, eerie glow. The windows offered no views, just dark reflections of what lay beyond. That night, after dinner, we decided to explore. The lake stretched out before us, dark and still, its surface barely disturbed by the breeze. The woods seemed to whisper, distant and unnerving, the kind of silence that felt too deliberate. We laughed nervously, dismissing it as just the night. E2 settling in. Later, back inside the cabin, Sarah pulled an old weathered book from a shelf, a thick leather-bound volume that looked as though it hadn't been touched in years. "Found this in the attic," she said, flipping through the yellowed pages. The words were strange, full of accounts of things that lived in the woods around the lake. They come when the water is still and the darkness is deep. Beware what lingers beneath the surface. The room grew quiet as Sarah read aloud. The pages seemed to tremble in her hands and the fire crackled more sharply in the silence. Ethan tried to explain it away, just old stories, nothing more, but the unease was already settling in. As the night wore on, we kept the fire burning, hoping to ward off the chill that had crept into the air. But it didn't seem to help. The whispers from the woods grew louder, impossible to ignore. A low, echoing that seemed to pulse with every beat of our hearts. I couldn't sleep. The room felt suffocating, the darkness pressing against the windows as if it was watching. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw distorted reflections in the glass, faces I couldn't recognize staring back at me. At some point, I gave up trying. I stood at the window watching the lake. It was strange, too still. The water's surface was like a mirror, reflecting nothing, not even the stars above. The trees had stopped moving altogether, as if frozen in time. Then I heard it, the soft splash of something hitting the water. A chill ran down my spine and I turned toward the sound. Nothing moved. The lake remained still, its surface smooth, as glass. Yet the noise had been real. The old house had been in our family for generations, sitting alone on the edge of town where the forest began to creep in. It was a place full of memories, both happy and strange, but none of us had ever ventured into the basement. The stories had always been there, whispered between family members in hushed tones, rumors of things unseen, of a door that led to something dark and ancient. It was a rainy evening when my curiosity finally got the better of me. The storm had been brewing all day, and the house seemed quieter than usual. I found myself standing at the basement door, the heavy old wood worn with age. The air was cold and damp, a stark contrast to the warmth of the house above. I hesitated. The tales told of strange noises echoing from the basement. Whispers carried through the narrow gaps, dragging voices that spoke in languages long forgotten. But tonight, something felt different. The silence was absolute. No creaks from the floorboards, no wind rattling the windows. Just stillness. Curiosity outweighed fear. I placed my hand on the brass doorknob and pushed. The door resisted at first, but with a firm shove it swung open into darkness. The staircase leading down was narrow and twisted, illuminated only by the faint glow of my phone's flashlight. Each step echoed louder than I expected, the creaks of the old wood unnerving in the quiet. I descended deeper into the basement, the temperature dropping with every footfall. The walls seemed to close in slightly, the air thickening with a strange energy. At the bottom, I reached the familiar concrete floor, cold and smooth beneath my feet. That's when I saw it. The basement was exactly as I remembered it, but there was something different about the far wall. A door. It was solid, made of metal, and stood out starkly against the old stone. My breath hitched. It wasn't supposed to be there. The basement had always been empty, unfinished, and yet there it stood, ominous and locked tight. I tried the handle, expecting resistance, but it turned easily. The door opened with a slow, heavy creak. Beyond, there was only blackness. Not a typical basement darkness, but something deeper, more suffocating. I hesitated again, the chill biting at my skin. The whispers started as a low hum in the back of my mind, a sound that wasn't quite a voice, but something more primal, more insistent. They whispered names, fragments of words that didn't belong to any language I knew. Despite the fear clawing at my senses, I pushed forward into the darkness. The room was cold, with a faint smell of decay in the air. I could feel the presence of something ancient, something that had been waiting behind that door for a very long time. The whispers grew louder as I moved deeper into the space, surrounding me like a dark tide. They were no longer words, just a maddening, endless hum that seemed to come from within my own mind. My breath hitched, and my pulse quickened with each step. Suddenly, I froze. In the corner of the room, something shifted. A figure, not human, not entirely. Its shape was fluid, shifting between shadow and substance, its outline distorted by the oppressive darkness. Its eyes glowed faintly, red and empty, piercing through the blackness like embers. "Leave," it whispered, its voice hollow and inhuman. "You shouldn't be here." I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. The room seemed to tighten around me, the walls closing in further. The entity moved slowly towards me, its form bending unnaturally. "Go," it hissed again. "You will wake them." The panic surged, but I forced myself to turn and climb back toward the door. The whispers escalated, their volume unbearable. "Leave! Leave!" As my hand touched the metal handle once more, the darkness behind me lunged forward, a wave of shadowy tendrils reaching out to grasp my legs. It had been years since I last visited my grandparents' old house in the countryside. After they passed away, the house sat empty, and the forest that surrounded it seemed to close in on the place, whispering secrets only the trees knew. When my parents suggested we return to clear out some of their belongings, I hesitated but agreed. There was something about the old place that still pulled at me. The house was a large, decrepit structure with faded paint and broken shutters. The silence inside was oppressive, as though the walls themselves held their breath. The forest loomed beyond the backyard, stretching endlessly into the distance. It had always been unsettling, too quiet, too dark, and today it felt even more so. As we worked through the rooms, sorting through forgotten memories and decades-old clutter, I stumbled upon a room I didn't remember. The door was slightly ajar, the faint sound of rusted hinges echoing softly as I pushed it open. Inside was a dusty, long-forgotten library. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and mildew. Among the cobwebbed bookshelves, I found a journal. Its cover was made of rough, bark-like leather, and the pages inside were yellowed with age. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. The handwriting was meticulous, but the words made my stomach turn. "The woods do not welcome strangers. They know your secrets before you do. They whisper your name, sometimes aloud, sometimes in your mind." I flipped the page. The entries were more disturbing. Stories of travelers lost in the forest, their bodies never found. Of footsteps in the snow that led nowhere. Of voices heard calling in the dark. It was the kind of writing that made the air in the room grow, colder with each word. I called out to my parents, but the sound barely echoed back. The rest of the house felt distant, as though the walls themselves were trying to push us away. The journal slipped from my hands, and I couldn't help but glance out the window. The woods looked darker than before, the trees shifting subtly as though watching. That night we sat in the living room, the fire crackling feebly. The house creaked and groaned around us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was standing just beyond the windows, hidden in the shadows. Every sound, the wind, the distant rustling of leaves, felt deliberate, as if it was drawing closer. Then I heard it, a soft, breathy whisper. My name. Not from the wind, not from my parents, but inside my head. I froze, the hairs on my arms, standing on end. "Hello?" I whispered back, but no response came. Hours passed and the silence became unbearable. My parents seemed unaware, lost in their conversation, but I could feel something watching me, waiting. The house was no longer a refuge, it was a prison. Suddenly, a heavy knock echoed from upstairs. The invitation came through an old, tattered postcard. "Join us at the house beneath the hill," it read in uneven handwriting, barely legible. The address was listed, but it seemed out of place, secluded from any town or city I knew. Still, something, about it called to me. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to go. The drive was long and winding. The road was barely a path, cutting through dense forest and disappearing into shadows. The sun had set by the time I reached the old house, sheets, large, decrepit structure half buried in overgrown vines. Its windows were dark, the roof sagging under the weight of years. It looked abandoned, yet there was a strange warmth that drew me closer. Inside, the house was just as eerie. Dust covered every surface and the air was thick with the scent of decay. A single candle flickered on the fireplace mantel, casting flickering shadows that danced across the cracked walls. The atmosphere was unsettling, almost alive in its silence. "Welcome," a voice rasped from the corner of the room. A figure emerged from the shadows, a woman with hollow eyes and a voice that sounded as though it hadn't been used in years. "You've come." I nodded, though my heart was pounding in my chest. "Who are you?" She didn't answer. Instead, she handed me an old, leather-bound book. "Read," she said simply, her voice hauntingly soft. The book was filled with strange writings and crude illustrations, creatures half seen, whispers on the edge of understanding. The pages were worn, and some entries had been scribbled out in haste. As I read, the candle flickered violently, the shadows shifting unnaturally. "They live beneath the house, waiting. They move when you sleep, crawling through the darkness. Do not look away from the walls." The room grew colder with each word. I couldn't tear my gaze away from the page, even though the terror was tightening its grip around me. The woman stood silently, her eyes locked onto mine, unblinking. Suddenly, I felt it, the shift. The air warped, distorting around the edges of the room. A cold breath passed over my neck, though there was no draft. Shadows coiled around the corners, their forms becoming more defined, more real. "Who are they?" I whispered, my voice cracking. "They are what you fear most," she said, her voice like a ghostly hum. "They see everything, and they will. Come." A sharp knock echoed through the house, loud and abrupt. It seemed to come from inside the walls, everywhere at once. My pulse raced. I looked around, but there was no one else there, only the woman and the candle. "Leave," she commanded. I stumbled back, dropping the book as I backed toward the door. The house seemed to shrink, the walls closing in on me. Shadows writhed along the floor, their whispers a cacophony of breathless voices. I ran, not daring to look back. Outside, the night was suffocating. The forest surrounded the house, stretching into darkness as far as I could see. My breath came in ragged gasps, but the house still loomed in my mind's eye, its windows glowing faintly as if they watched my every move. Days passed, but the memories haunted me. The images from the book remained vivid, and every shadow I saw seemed to move on its own. I tried to convince myself it was just fear, but the feeling of something unseen, watching, waiting, was impossible to shake. I've never returned to the house beneath the hill. The invitation is still somewhere, buried among old papers, waiting for someone else to answer it. But I know better now. Some things should never be uncovered, and some places should never be approached. The house was old. Too old. Its weathered wood stood on the edge of a cliff overlooking the ocean. The surrounding trees clawed at the sky, their branches casting long, distorted shadows on the ground. My friends and I had stumbled upon it during a late-night hike, curious and foolish, eager to explore the mystery hidden in the isolation of the wilderness. As we approached the house, the chill in the air grew more pronounced. The windows were dark, their glass cracked and fogged. The door creaked on its rusted hinges as we pushed it open, revealing a space that hadn't seen light in decades. Dust covered every surface, and the scent of decay hung heavy in the room. "I don't think we should stay," Emma whispered, her voice shaky. Her flashlight flickered, casting brief moments of light into the shadows. But curiosity pulled us forward. The rooms were small and cramped, filled with forgotten belongings, an old rocking chair, books turned to dust, faded photographs pinned to the walls. There was a sense of abandonment, as though the house itself was mourning its past. In one of the back rooms, we found a trunk. The rusted latch snapped open with a groan, revealing layers of yellowed papers and brittle letters. Most were illegible, but one stood out, a diary, barely held together by fragile string. The pages were stained with ink, but the handwriting was clear, if unsettling. "They come at night," it read. "Not with footsteps. They whisper, and the sound seeps into your mind." We paused, exchanging uneasy glances. "It's just an old story," Liam said, trying to break the tension. "Probably something written by a lonely old woman." But Emma shook her head, her hand trembling as she traced the inked letters. "It feels real." The house seemed to darken around us. The wind howled through broken windows, sending cold drafts through the rooms. Shadows flickered in the corners of our vision, shapes that twisted and disappeared as soon as we tried to focus on them. "We need to get out," Emma urged again, her voice desperate now. "Something isn't right." Suddenly, the whispers began, soft, indistinct at first, just the faintest murmur at the edge of hearing. We froze, our breath caught in our throats. The whispers grew louder, weaving through the air, surrounding us. "Leave," they said. "You shouldn't be here." We turned to run, but the door slammed shut with a thunderous crack. No one was near the handle. The windows fogged over, blocking out any light. The shadows deepened, stretching across the room in unnatural ways. "Stay," the whispers hissed. "We know you now." Panic set in. We screamed for help, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. My flashlight flickered wildly before going out completely. The room was pitch black, and the whispers were deafening. They filled the air, suffocating, each one more chilling than the last. "Please," Emma cried, tears streaming down her face. "We didn't mean to come here." The whispers grew into laughter, harsh, cruel laughter that echoed through the house. The shadows seemed to pulse with life, closing in around us. We pressed against the walls, trying to make ourselves disappear, but the darkness was relentless. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the laughter stopped. The whispers quieted to a haunting silence. The air felt heavier. It started during a weekend camping trip deep in the forest. There were 6 of us, old friends who'd spent countless nights by a campfire, laughing, telling stories, and making memories. It was supposed to be no different this time, just a simple getaway to reconnect. The campsite was nestled on the edge of the woods, surrounded by towering trees that loomed like sentinels in the fading light of day. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the distant hum of insects. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the first eerie sense of quiet settled in, unsettling in its absolute stillness. That night, we set up camp, cooked a simple meal, and gathered around the fire, telling ghost stories that we thought we had outgrown. It was all in good fun until something didn't feel right. One of us, let's call him A, had brought a Polaroid camera to capture the memories. We teased him about it saying it was a bit outdated, but he insisted on documenting everything. Each time the camera clicked, we'd lean in close, laughing as the image developed in slow, haunting, white bursts of light. After a few photos, the laughter turned into uneasy silences. A's next photo didn't come out right. The flash illuminated the dark outline of the woods behind us, a shadowy figure obscured by trees. But when the image developed, there was nothing there. It was just a black void where something had been. We dismissed it, laughing uneasily, thinking the woods were just playing tricks on our minds. But as the night wore on, the unease grew stronger. Small, inexplicable things began to happen. The distant hoot of an owl sounded wrong, like it was watching us too closely. The gentle rustling of leaves turned into footsteps, faint, deliberate. It was Kay who first noticed something. Sitting near the edge of camp, staring into the dark forest, she called out, her voice trembling. "Who's there?" Silence. A few of us looked up, searching the shadows, but there was nothing. It was ridiculous, we all thought. The wind, perhaps, or our minds playing tricks again. But it wasn't long before Elle said she heard a voice, soft, almost whispering. It was too low to make out the words, just an indistinct murmur that sent chills down her spine. We crowded together, listening, but there was nothing. Still, that night, sleep was restless. Each of us was on edge, half expecting something to creep out of the woods. Every snap of a twig, every distant rustle of leaves had us frozen in place. I set up a makeshift perimeter with flashlights in hopes of keeping whatever it was at bay. Then came the camera again. A held it steady, his fingers trembling. A simple photograph. The flash illuminated the scene, trees, the fire, us, but as the picture developed, the figure was there. In the corner, shadowed by the dense trees, a tall, pale form with hollow eyes stared into the lens. This time, we all saw it. Panic set in. No one wanted to stay near the woods, but the thought of leaving the campsite seemed even worse. We decided to stay close to the fire, all together, while A destroyed the photos, insisting they were too disturbing to keep. The night passed slowly. The whispers became louder, surrounding us from all sides. Sometimes they sounded like mournful pleas. Other times they were low chuckles, hollow and cold. Whatever it was, it knew we were there. Around dawn, exhaustion finally overtook our fear, and we fell into a restless sleep. But even in sleep, we were haunted. Dreams twisted into dark, suffocating nightmares where the figure loomed, inching closer, its whispered voice growing clearer, calling our names in the faintest, haunting tones. When we awoke, the sun was high, but the fear was not gone. The campsite felt heavier. It started as a simple renovation project. We were fixing up an old farmhouse we had recently purchased. The house had character, creaky wooden floors, antique fixtures, and a sprawling, overgrown yard. But beneath the charm lay something unsettling. The basement was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and forgotten memories. The wooden stairs creaked as we descended, the sound echoing unnaturally loud. My flashlight barely cut through the oppressive darkness, and the faint hum of the old flickering bulbs above did little to illuminate the space. Boxes lined the walls, some filled with forgotten family heirlooms, others with items that hadn't been touched in decades. The deeper we went, the colder it became, until a shiver ran down my spine. It wasn't the kind of cold you feel when exposed to the elements. It was something more unnatural, something that settled in your bones. Then, in the farthest corner, we found it, a wooden door, unmarked, almost hidden by the layers of dust and cobwebs. The handle was rusted, nearly falling off when I touched it. My curiosity got the better of me. With a hesitant push, the door creaked open. Beyond was a room we hadn't expected, a strange, sterile space that felt disconnected from the rest of the basement. The walls were lined with old medical equipment, iron examination tables forgotten, syringes, and cabinets filled with jars of specimens preserved in formaldehyde. It looked more like a clinic from another era, abandoned and untouched by time. "That can't be right," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. My flashlight flickered, once more casting unsettling shadows against the walls. The glass containers held twisted, lifeless shapes. A malformed fetus, misshapen limbs, and something that looked far too human. The specimens seemed to pulse ever so slightly, like they were breathing, their glassy eyes reflecting back at us. "Let's get out of here," I urged, but as we turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang. The sound reverberated through the basement, trapping us in darkness. Whispers filled the air, soft, guttural voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Stay," they hissed. "Stay." Fear gripped us, our breaths coming in short, gasps as the air grew colder still. My flashlight was useless now, its beam barely illuminating the faint outlines of the grotesque figures in the jars. The whispers grew louder, morphing into something menacing, a chorus of voices, distorted and pleading. Suddenly, the medical equipment around us began to move. Tables shaking, cabinets sliding open on their own, and the jars tilting as if something unseen was shifting inside them. The specimens writhed, their features twisting into unnatural forms. I could barely scream as I felt something brush against my hand, a cold, bony finger wrapping around mine. In that moment, the voices screamed, inside my head, "You shouldn't have come here." The room dissolved into madness and darkness consumed everything. It all started with an old mirror. I found it at a thrift store, hidden away in the corner behind dusty glassware and forgotten books. The frame was ornate, carved with swirling patterns that looked like faces, and the glass itself had a faint, eerie shimmer. Something about it drew me in, despite the warning I felt deep down. At first, it hung on the wall in my bedroom, reflecting the room just fine. But after a few nights, strange things began happening. The reflection wasn't always the same. Sometimes I'd see figures moving in the background, shadows that weren't there in real life. The mirror seemed to distort reality, bending light and angles in ways I couldn't explain. One evening, I was getting ready for bed when I noticed a new detail. The reflection in the mirror wasn't just showing the room. It was showing something else. Behind my bed, a door appeared, solid wood with a brass handle. I spun around, but there was no door, just my plain wall. Frightened, I tried to remove the mirror, but it wouldn't budge from the wall. My hands trembled as I examined the glass again. A faint scratching noise came from inside it, a low, deliberate sound, like nails dragging slowly across the surface. I could barely hear it over the beating of my heart. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel eyes watching me from within the mirror. Shadows flickered in the corners, and I heard whispers, soft and insistent, calling out my name. In the morning, I covered the mirror with a sheet, desperate to block its gaze. But when I peeked under the fabric, the reflection was still there, unchanged. Worse, my reflection was no longer alone. The shadows had crept into it, crowding around me, their distorted faces pressed close against the glass. Weeks passed, and things only worsened. My friends noticed that I wasn't the same. Tired, pale, and distant. They begged me to remove the mirror, but it was like it had fused with the wall. Even when I destroyed the frame, the glass wouldn't shatter. It stayed intact, pulsing faintly like something alive beneath the surface. One day, while cleaning the remnants, I noticed a faint message etched into the glass. "You let me in," it said, written in thin, ghostly script. That night, the mirror whispered once more, "I'm here." And I knew then I could never escape. It was late afternoon when we arrived at the edge of the forest, a dense, ancient expanse stretching far beyond what we could see. My friends and I were on a camping trip, seeking adventure away from the familiar world. The air was crisp, and the sun pierced through the canopy in sporadic beams. The forest seemed peaceful, but something felt off. We set up our tents near a small clearing, surrounded by towering trees with gnarled branches. The sounds of nature were soothing at first, the distant rustling of leaves, the occasional call of a bird. But as night approached, a strange stillness settled in. The woods were silent, almost too quiet, as though even the animals avoided the area. As we sat around the fire, eating our meals, we began to notice the whispers. At first, it was faint, a distant murmur like the wind brushing through the leaves. But it grew louder, more distinct. Words we couldn't quite make out, voices we couldn't pinpoint. My friends exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. "What is that?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "It's nothing," I said, though my stomach churned with unease. "Just the wind." But the wind didn't explain the chilling way the whispers seemed to form sentences. Phrases like, "You shouldn't have come," and "leave," floated through the air, winding between the trees. They were soft at first, almost imperceptible, but gradually grew louder. We huddled closer to the fire, trying to ignore the eerie sounds. But no matter how loudly we talked or laughed, the whispers never ceased. They followed us, weaving through the branches, becoming louder with every passing minute. Suddenly, one of my friends, Marcus, shouted, "Stop! Stop whispering!" His voice echoed through the still night. The whispers paused, and for a moment, the woods felt utterly silent. But then they came back, closer now, more desperate. They weren't just voices anymore. They were inhuman, guttural, almost like something wrong. I scrambled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The trees loomed, their twisted shapes casting unnaturally long shadows. The whispers became screams, not of rage or anger, but of despair, a haunting chorus of agony and sorrow that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The fire flickered violently, almost dying out as though being consumed by the darkness. Panic surged through us. Emily screamed, dropping her belongings as we rushed toward the tents. We couldn't run. Our feet seemed rooted to the ground. The whispers intensified into deafening howls, and something slithered through the edges of the light, dark shapes twisting in and out of view. The forest seemed alive. Its branches stretched, its roots pulling at the earth as though reaching for something hidden. I turned back to the clearing, gasping for breath, and saw it, a silhouette, pale and gaunt, standing just beyond the edge of the light. Its eyes were hollow, voids of blackness staring into my soul. "Leave," it hissed, and its voice was not human, not animal, something far worse. It wasn't a sound at all, but a presence, a force so malevolent it tore through the very fabric of reality. A blinding light erupted from my flashlight as I screamed, and in that moment of pure terror, everything vanished. When I awoke, the fire had gone out. My friends were gone. The whispers still echo in my mind. It started on a lonely highway, the kind where the horizon stretches forever, and the stars above are brighter than the taillights in front of you. I'd been driving for hours that night, making my way home after a weekend visit with friends. The radio was off, my phone was dead, and the only sound was the low hum of the tires on asphalt. Somewhere around mile marker 116, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. They were distant at first, faint pinpricks on the horizon, but as I glanced back, they seemed to be closing in faster than they should. A little too fast. I kept driving, telling myself it was probably just someone speeding. But the headlights grew brighter and brighter until they were nearly blinding, tailing me aggressively. My pulse quickened as the car behind me swerved slightly as if trying to pass, then fell back, only to repeat the motion seconds later. I tapped my brakes lightly, hoping they'd back off, but they didn't. Instead, their car pulled up beside me, matching my speed. Through my peripheral vision, I could see the vehicle, a black sedan, its windows dark and impossible to see through. I glanced over, trying to catch a glimpse of the driver, but there was no one inside. The steering wheel moved on its own, the car swerving closer to mine. My heart pounded as I gripped the wheel tighter, accelerating in a panic. The black sedan followed, its engine roaring louder than my own. "Leave me alone," I yelled, though no one could hear me. Suddenly, the sedan shot forward, cutting me off and forcing me to slam on the brakes. My car skidded, tires screeching, as I came to a halt in the middle of the highway. The black sedan idled in front of me for a moment, its taillights glowing like red eyes in the darkness. Then, as abruptly as it had appeared, it sped off into the distance, disappearing into the night. I sat there for a moment, my chest heaving, trying to collect myself. The highway was empty again, as if nothing had happened. I checked the time on the dashboard. It was just past 1 a.m. I told myself it was over, just some kind of bizarre road rage incident. Shaking, I pulled back onto the road and continued, driving. A few miles later, I saw something in the distance. My stomach dropped as I realized it was the black sedan, parked on the shoulder with its hazard lights flashing. I slowed instinctively, unsure of what to do. As I passed, I craned my neck to look inside the car. It was empty. No driver, no passengers, nothing. I didn't wait to figure it out. My foot slammed on the gas, the car roaring as I sped away. But the moment I looked in my rearview mirror, the headlights were back. They had appeared from nowhere, closer than before, and they were gaining on me fast. The next few minutes were a blur of panic. I weaved in and out of lanes, trying to lose the car, but it was relentless, always inches behind me. My speedometer climbed past 90, then 100, the road a black ribbon stretching endlessly ahead. Then, without warning, the headlights vanished. Let out a shaky breath, thinking it was finally over, but I was wrong. The air in my car turned ice cold, my breath visible in the sudden chill. A foul smell filled the cabin, like burnt rubber and decay. My radio, though it was off, began to hiss with static. "Why are you running?" A voice crackled through the speakers, low, guttural, and not human. I froze, my hands trembling on the wheel. The voice came again, louder this time. "You can't escape." My rearview mirror showed something I'll never forget. A shadowy figure sitting in my back seat, its face obscured, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I swerved violently, nearly losing control of the car. When I looked back, it was gone. The highway stretched on, empty and endless. I drove for hours, afraid to stop, afraid to look anywhere but straight ahead. When I finally reached the next town, I pulled into a gas station and stumbled out of the car, shaking. The attendant looked up from the counter, startled by my appearance. "Rough night?" he asked. I nodded, too rattled to explain. As I turned back to the car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the dusty rear window, someone, or something, had written a single word from the inside. "Soon." It was an ordinary evening when my husband and I decided to take a walk through the woods near our new home. The sun was setting behind the trees, casting long shadows across the trail. We had moved here just a few weeks ago, and the quiet seclusion had been one of the main reasons for choosing this area. The woods were vast, with tall, twisted trees stretching toward the sky. We followed a narrow path that curved around a small, stagnant pond. The air was cool and still, and everything felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. It was strange how the forest seemed to absorb sound, leaving only the faint rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. "We should turn back soon," I said, squeezing my husband's hand. His grip tightened slightly as we moved deeper into the shadows. Suddenly, we heard a faint humming. It wasn't coming from any direction we could identify. It was low, rhythmic, like a chant that seemed to pulse in sync with the trees. The air grew colder, heavier, and I began to feel uneasy. "What is that?" I whispered. "I don't know," my husband replied, his voice strained. The humming grew louder. It was like a song we couldn't understand, the words slithering around in the darkness. We paused, holding our breath, listening. The forest seemed alive, too alive. Every shadow moved slightly, shifting shapes that were impossible to make out. Suddenly, the path ahead seemed to narrow, the trees closing in on us. The woods felt like a living, breathing entity, and we were lost within it. My phone had no signal, and the sky had turned an unnatural shade of deep blue. A low growl echoed behind us. My husband turned quickly, flashlight raised, but there was nothing there, just more trees. Yet the sound continued, closer now, a raspy, guttural sound that chilled my bones. "We need to get out of here," he whispered, urgency thick in his even voice. We started walking faster, the hum still surrounding us, getting louder with every step. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt the cold hands of fear gripping at my throat. Then I saw it. A figure, tall, shadowy, and humanoid, standing at the edge of the trail. Its eyes glowed faintly, a pale, unnatural light cutting through the darkness. I stopped, frozen, unable to move. My husband called my name, his voice distant as if underwater. The figure began to move, slowly at first, its long, thin arms extending toward us. The humming reached a fever pitch, vibrating in the air like a symphony of madness. My breath hitched, and my vision blurred as if something was bending reality itself around us. "Run!" my husband yelled, yanking me forward. We sprinted through the woods, the figure always just behind us, its presence closing in. I could feel its cold breath on my neck, hear its whispering voice in my mind. "You're mine now." We didn't stop. The path twisted and turned endlessly, but somehow we kept moving forward. The humming finally faded, and the creature's presence slowly receded, retreating back into the shadows. Breathless and trembling, we broke through the tree line into the clearing near the pond. The sound of the forest was gone, leaving only the distant croak of a frog. My husband dropped to his knees, gasping for air, as I collapsed beside him. What was that?" I whispered. He shook his head, eyes wide. "Something we shouldn't have found." The hollow woods were still. It was supposed to be a weekend camping trip, just my friends and I in the middle of nowhere. No cell service, no crowds, just a quiet patch of forest surrounded by rolling hills. We'd packed enough supplies to last the weekend: tents, sleeping, bags, and plenty of food. But something felt off from the moment we arrived. The forest was dense with towering trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. As we set up camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Strange noises echoed through the trees, branches snapping, low whispers, and they came from nowhere and everywhere, at once. That night we gathered around the fire telling stories and laughing. But as the fire dimmed, the whispers grew louder. Each sound seemed to brush against the edge of my awareness. A voice in the dark, indistinct and unsettling. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, shivering despite the heat from the fire. "Hear what?" Sophie replied, her voice uneasy. "Stop being paranoid." But the whispering didn't stop. It was almost as if something was moving through the trees, circling us. The wind howled faintly through the leaves, but it wasn't the wind alone. Shadows danced among the trees, shifting and twisting in ways they shouldn't have been able to. Inside the tent that night, sleep refused to come. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of the tent fabric was amplified 1,000-fold. I kept my flashlight close, shining it around the tent at regular intervals. The darkness outside seemed unnatural, too deep, too still. At some point I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate steps moving around the camp. I sat up abruptly, my heart pounding. My friends were still asleep, unaware. I peeked through the tense fabric, hoping to catch a glimpse, but there was nothing. Only darkness. The next morning, we packed up in haste. None of us mentioned what had happened during the night, but the tension was palpable. Something about the forest didn't feel right anymore. As we returned along the trail we'd hiked in on, I found my phone miraculously had signal again. I pulled it out to snap a photo of the scenery. When I reviewed the image later, I nearly dropped my phone in shock. In the background of the photo, just barely visible between the trees, was a face, pale, twisted, and watching us. We never camped there again. Last winter, my friends and I rented a remote lodge in the mountains. It was meant to be a relaxing getaway, just snowboarding, hot cocoa, and the crackling warmth of a fireplace. The lodge was nestled deep in the forest, far from any other people, and the snowstorm that hit on the first night made sure we were completely cut off. The place was massive, 3 stories tall with creaky wooden floors, dark hallways, and antique furniture that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The first night was cozy. We sat by the fire, played board games, and told ghost stories. But as the storm raged outside, something started to feel wrong. Around midnight, I woke up to a faint noise, a rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming, on a window. I brushed it off, thinking it was just a branch hitting the glass in the wind. But when I checked, there was no branch, and the window was perfectly still. The next morning, my friend Claire said she'd heard footsteps in the hallway during the night. They were slow, like someone was pacing, she said, laughing nervously. We joked about the lodge being haunted, but her unease stuck with me. That evening, the power went out. It wasn't surprising, given the storm, but the timing felt off. The fireplace was still roaring, so we gathered around it, using flashlights and lanterns to light the room. The howling wind outside made the old house groan and creak like it was alive. While we sat there, we heard a loud thud upstairs. It wasn't a subtle sound. It was deliberate, like something heavy had been dropped. We all froze, staring at each other. "What was that?" Ethan whispered. "Probably just the wind," I said, trying to keep everyone calm. But deep down, I didn't believe it. Another sound followed, this one sharper, a dragging noise like furniture being pulled across the floor. It came from the 3rd floor, the part of the house we hadn't explored yet. Against my better judgment, we decided to investigate. Armed with flashlights, we climbed the narrow, creaking staircase to the 3rd floor. The air was colder up there, and the hallways felt narrower, the shadows darker. We checked every room, old bedrooms, storage spaces, but they were all empty. Finally, we reached the last door, at the very end of the hall. It was locked. "Let's just go back downstairs," Claire pleaded, but Ethan was already fiddling with the doorknob. With a loud snap, the lock gave way, and the door creaked open. Inside was a small room, bare except for a single wooden chair in the center. On the floor, around the chair, were deep scratches, as if it had been dragged back and forth for years. The air smelled foul, like rotting wood and mildew. On the far wall was a mirror, cracked and dusty. As we stepped inside, our flashlight beams bounced off the glass. For a moment, I thought I saw something move inside the reflection. Something that wasn't us. "Do you see that?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. We stared at the mirror. The room behind us was empty, but in the reflection there was a figure sitting in the chair. It was pale, hunched, and facing away from us. Ethan shone his flashlight directly at the chair. It was empty. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. But as we turned to leave, the door slammed shut. The sound was deafening, like it had been slammed by an unseen hand. The mirror's reflection shifted. The figure stood up, slowly turning to face us. Its face was blank, featureless, yet its presence was overwhelming. It stepped closer in the reflection, though nothing moved in the room. Then the glass shattered. We screamed, bolting for the door. It wouldn't budge. The air grew icy and the walls seemed to close in. Behind us, I heard the faint sound of footsteps. Soft. At first, then heavier, faster, coming straight toward us. Just as the door finally gave way, the room plunged into silence. We stumbled back down the stairs, hearts racing. No one spoke for the rest of the night, and we left the lodge the moment the storm cleared. I don't know what we saw in that mirror, or why it was there. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still hear the faint sound of a chair dragging across the floor. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip, a chance to escape the city and get lost in nature. My friends and I packed everything we needed: tents, sleeping bags, flashlights, and a few board games to pass the time. We headed deep into the forest, far from the nearest trail. No cell service, no signals, just us and the wilderness. We found a clearing by a small, still lake, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. The air was crisp, the scent of pine filling our lungs. It was peaceful at first. That night, around the campfire, the stories began. Nothing unusual at first, just ghost stories and campfire tales. But as the fire flickered, someone mentioned the abandoned camp across the lake, deep within the woods. "It's been there for years," Alex said, his voice low and hushed. "People say it's cursed. Kids who go there, they don't come back." We all laughed, brushing it off as nonsense. But deep down, the idea stuck with us. The others decided to ignore it, but I couldn't. Curiosity gnawed at me. That same night, after everyone had settled into their tents, I grabbed my flashlight and slipped away from camp. The walk was eerie. The woods were silent, save for the distant hoot of an owl and the crunch of dead leaves beneath my boots. The lake shimmered in the moonlight as I approached the other side, the camp looming ahead like a forgotten relic. The first thing I noticed was how empty it felt. The tents were still up, but they were torn, left to rot. Old cooking supplies lay abandoned next to burnt-out campfires. It was like the occupants had vanished overnight. I stepped cautiously through the campsite, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Every snap of a twig made me pause. Every shadow stretched unnaturally against the flickering light. A chill ran down my spine as I moved further in. Then I saw it. The building. A long, decrepit mess hall stood at the center of the camp. It had broken windows and a gaping front door. My heart skipped a beat. Despite the absence of life, there was a strange sense of something watching me. Inside, the mess hall was a ruin. The tables had rotted away, the floor warped with decay. The walls were covered in old graffiti, sick drawings, symbols I couldn't recognize, and strange messages scrawled in what looked like dried blood. I moved cautiously through the mess hall, snapping photos with my camera. Each flash illuminated something more disturbing: shadows flickering in the corners, faint whispers in the dark. My breath quickened. Then the whispers became louder, more distinct. They sounded like children, soft, innocent voices, but their words were unsettling. "You shouldn't be here." I froze, the weight of the darkness pressing against my back. The whispers echoed in my head and every instinct told me to run, but my legs refused to move. I was trapped. Suddenly, a louder noise, a sharp cracking sound like someone stepping on a branch behind me. I turned, but the room was empty. No one was there. Still, the whispers continued, persistent, growing louder. I swung my flashlight around, desperate for a glimpse of anything. That's when I saw it. The faintest glimpse of a figure in the shadows. A child. Small, pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to peer directly into my soul. The figure didn't move, just stood there, silently watching from the darkness. My breath hitched. I snapped a photo without thinking, and when the flash went off, the child's face contorted, twisted into something grotesque and unnatural. Its smile was too wide, teeth too sharp. It opened its mouth in a silent scream. I bolted. The flashlight flickered and went dark, but I didn't stop running. Behind me, the whispers screamed louder, the child's figure darting from shadow to shadow. I crashed through trees, the forest closing in around me. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, I saw the lake. The shore was a blur in the moonlight, but my tent was in sight. My friends were still there, safe, breathing. I fell into camp, gasping for air. They were startled, but I couldn't explain it. I didn't need to. The fear was still etched into my mind. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. The next morning, we packed up quickly and left the forest. As we drove away, I glanced back at the distant lake, and in the reflection, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure stood at the edge of the water. The child, watching us, smiling. It had been years since anyone had dared venture near the old well at the edge of town. The stories surrounding it were whispered among the locals. Tales of strange sounds, vanished hikers, and eerie lights that flickered in the dead of night. Most people avoided the well, not out of fear, but out of respect for the ominous legends. But curiosity got the better of me. One late autumn evening, after hearing so many eerie tales, I decided to visit the well alone. My friends had all warned me not to go, but I couldn't resist. The town's ancient history called to me, and the thought of uncovering some forgotten mystery was too tempting. The path to the well was overgrown, hidden beneath layers of fallen leaves and twisted roots. Darkness cloaked the forest, the trees leaning in like they had stories to tell. It was cold, so cold that even my breath formed thick clouds in the air. The faint glimmer of the well came into view as I pushed my way through the underbrush. Well itself was old, crumbling stone with a rusted metal bucket sitting awkwardly in its center. The air felt heavy, unnatural, a sense of dread wrapping around my chest. A dim, flickering lantern hung from the well's side, casting strange shadows that twisted unnaturally in the dark. I set my flashlight on the ground and leaned in close to inspect it. The hole was deep, much deeper than it should have been. The sound of dripping water echoed from the bottom, a slow, monotonous drip that made my skin crawl. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper. It wasn't coming from the well. It came from behind me, from deeper within the woods. It was a woman's voice, soft yet chilling, almost melodic. She was saying something, but the words were indistinct, like they were spoken in a language, lost to time. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. Silence. I turned back toward the well, gripping my flashlight tightly. The chill deepened and the shadows seemed to shift once again, moving closer, circling the well. There was something unsettling about the way they moved, not driven by wind or natural causes. The lantern flickered harder, its flame sputtering as if something unseen was feeding on it. I reached down to retrieve my flashlight, but as my hand brushed the cold metal, I saw it. Faces, hundreds of them, distorted and gray, pressed against the surface of the water at the bottom of the well. The faces were crying. Silent tears slid down their features, blending into the dark water. Their mouths were twisted in expressions of pain and longing, and their eyes, oh their eyes, hollow, empty, and searching. A sudden gust of wind howled through the trees, snapping the silence. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me now, voices overlapping and blending into a terrifying symphony of sorrow. I could hear them pleading, crying out, voices from the well, calling for something I couldn't understand. I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. "No," I whispered, though my voice trembled. I didn't realize how far I had retreated until my back hit the rough bark of a tree. The shadows closed in, their form no longer shapes, but human-like figures. Long, gaunt, with hollow faces and lifeless eyes. Their fingers reached out, elongated and grotesque, dragging across the surface of the well, clawing toward me. "Please," I begged, lifting the flashlight again. The beam cut through the darkness, pushing them back, but they came closer as if drawn to the light. "Leave!" I screamed, feeling my legs give out beneath me. The figures paused at the edge of the light. They stared at me, not with malice, but with despair. Then they began to fade into the shadows once more, their hollow eyes lingering in the darkness. When I looked back at the well, it was still, silent again, save for the slow drip of water. But the faces remained beneath the surface, watching, always watching. I stumbled back through the forest, my legs shaking, my breath uneven. The well was still behind me, a hollow abyss waiting, ready to consume anyone foolish enough to look inside. And I knew, some mysteries should never be uncovered. The amusement park was once the heart of the town. Bright lights, laughter, and the sounds of roller coasters echoing into the night. Now it was a shell of its former self, an abandoned wasteland of decaying rides and rusted metal. My friends, and I decided to explore it late one evening. The thrill of sneaking into a place that was supposed to be off limits too tempting to resist. The entrance gates were wide open, the rusted hinges creaking as we pushed them aside. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the faint scent of mold clinging to the wooden structures. The silence was eerie, broken only by the distant hum of the city fading into the distance. We wandered through the park, the familiar sights distorted in their abandonment. The carousel stood still, its horses frozen mid-gallop, the painted faces hollow and lifeless. The Ferris wheel, once a towering attraction, now loomed above us, its metal frame leaning dangerously with a low, ominous groan. "There's something off about this place," Emma said, her voice shaking. "It's too quiet." "I know," Jake whispered, looking over his shoulder nervously. "Let's just get out of here." But we couldn't leave yet. The allure of the forgotten amusement park pulled us deeper. We ventured past the decaying snack stands and ghostly game booths, their prize shelves empty and cobwebbed. The further we went, the darker it became, with only the faint glow of dying street lamps to guide us. The more we explored, the more unsettling things became. Every step felt heavier, the air colder. And then we saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the Ferris wheel, its silhouette dark against the fading lights of the city beyond. It was too tall, too thin, its shape twisted unnaturally. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. It didn't move. It just stood there, unmoving, watching. The silence stretched unbearably long. We stared at the figure frozen in place, the weight of the moment pressed down on us, suffocating. Then the figure raised a hand, a long, slender hand, and pointed toward the roller coaster. "No," Jake whispered. "We shouldn't." But something compelled us. The figure was beckoning, its motion slow and deliberate. We couldn't resist. We followed the shadow toward the skeletal remains of the roller coaster. Halfway through the ride, we stopped. Below us was a mess of twisted metal and broken tracks. The train cars had long since rotted away, left hanging eerily in the air. The entire structure groaned in protest, the sound of rust scraping against rust filling the silence. "We need to go back," Emma insisted. "Now!" But as we turned to leave, we heard a voice, a whisper, just behind us. "Why don't you stay?" I spun around. The figure was closer now, no longer just a silhouette. Its twisted form hovered above the ground, its face obscured in shadows. It was the embodiment of wrongness, a distorted, elongated being that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. "Run!" Jake shouted. We bolted, our footsteps pounding against the crumbling pavement. The figure followed effortlessly, its elongated strides covering the distance between us impossibly fast. The ground shook beneath its weight, the shattered rides shaking with each heavy step. We ducked into the ghostly funhouse, desperate to find a hiding spot. Inside, the warped mirrors reflected unsettling images. Faces twisted into screams, bodies shifting grotesquely. Emma let out a scream, her voice piercing the air, but it only seemed to anger whatever was chasing us. The hallways stretched impossibly, the walls closing in. The whispers became screams, louder and louder until we couldn't tell where they were coming from. The distortion of reality was overwhelming, a nightmare given form. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the screams stopped. The funhouse went silent. We crouched in the darkness, too afraid to move. And that's when we heard it. The laughter. Soft, high-pitched giggles echoing from somewhere deep within the building. The laughter grew louder, echoing off the warped walls. It was coming closer. "Wake up!" Jake whispered frantically, shaking me. "It's a nightmare. Wake up!" But it wasn't a nightmare. It was real, and it wasn't letting us go. It was late when we arrived at the abandoned train station. My friends and I had heard stories, whispered tales about how the station wasn't as empty as it seemed. The building had been closed for years, surrounded by overgrown weeds and broken windows. The local authorities had shut it down after reports of strange happenings. Faint voices, flickering lights, and figures that appeared in photographs but couldn't be seen in person. Ryan, Mark, and I decided to explore anyway. We didn't believe in ghosts or curses. We brought flashlights, cameras, and our usual bravado, thinking it would be another uneventful adventure. The inside of the station was eerily quiet. The air was thick with dust, and the faint hum of old wires echoed softly in the empty corridors. We wandered through, taking photos of the decaying platform, the graffiti-covered walls, and the forgotten ticket counters. Nothing seemed unusual, at first, just a place frozen in time. As we continued deeper into the station, we noticed strange things. Mark's camera kept glitching, displaying flickering figures, hazy shadows that drifted through the pictures. At first, we dismissed it as a malfunction, but when Ryan's flashlight suddenly dimmed and then died entirely, we began to feel uneasy. "Okay," I said, forcing a laugh. "Let's call it a night. Nothing here is weird. Yet." But as we made our way back toward the entrance, things started to change. The station seemed quieter, if that was possible. The usual creaks of old wood and metal had stopped. The air grew colder, heavier. We walked past one of the boarded windows, but my flashlight suddenly flickered again. This time, I saw it. A figure, distorted, standing in the distance, just outside the glass. It wasn't moving, just staring. I could barely make out its face. Lips pulled into a grotesque, silent smile. Eyes hollow. "Guys, stop," I whispered, shining my light on the window. But the figure had already disappeared. "Nothing's there," Mark said, though his voice held a trace of doubt. "It's just the darkness playing tricks." We continued on, our unease growing. Then Ryan froze mid-step. His voice trembled as he whispered, "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" I strained to listen, but all I could hear was the faint hum of the station's ancient air conditioning. Mark shook his head. "Nothing but your imagination." Yet, as we turned down a long corridor, there was no mistaking it. A faint whisper, low and desperate, filled the air. It wasn't coming from anywhere we could see. It surrounded us, echoing in every direction. "We need to leave," Ryan said, urgently. Now! The station had become a maze, twisting and turning with no clear way back. Our flashlights flickered again, one by one, until the darkness consumed us. We were left in total blackness. Then, from somewhere nearby, we heard it again. A voice, almost indistinguishable. But this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was laughter. It was closer. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing my friends by the arms. But our feet felt heavier, our breathing labored. The laughter echoed through the walls, louder now, malicious and hollow. As we stumbled into what we thought was an exit, we emerged into a different room, one with photos lining the walls. They were the same photographs we had taken earlier, but these were different. Faces, hundreds of them. People we had never seen before, staring back at us with hollow, lifeless eyes. Some were smiling grotesquely, their mouths open in silent screams. "Get out of here!" Mark screamed, his voice cracking as we tried to back away. But something grabbed my arm, cold, clammy fingers that burned into my skin. I looked down and saw it. A reflection in the shattered glass of one of the photographs. A figure stood behind me, its face just behind mine, closer than it should have been. "No," I gasped. The figure tilted its head, its lips curving into that horrifying smile. It wasn't breathing, it wasn't human. Yet its gaze bore into mine with an unsettling hunger. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. Then the lights flickered, one last time, and the figure vanished. The photographs crumbled into ash, and the darkness around us lifted just enough for us to see the entrance again. We ran. Outside the station, we collapsed in the dirt, gasping for breath. The building stood still behind us, silent once more. But the air was different now. The weight of the station lingered in our chests. We had survived, but something had followed us, and we knew, deep down, that it wasn't truly gone. It started as an unusual assignment, a request to photograph an old family estate, long abandoned and rumored to be haunted. The client was distant, offering little explanation, only that the house was a legacy they couldn't bring themselves to revisit. I hesitated at first, but curiosity and the promise of a hefty paycheck pushed me forward. The house was secluded, located far beyond the reach of any well-worn road. Overgrown vines crawled up its stone walls, and the windows were covered in a thick layer of dust. It felt like stepping into a time capsule, forgotten by the modern world. The air inside was still, heavy with age, and the scent of decay hung in the shadows. As I wandered through the rooms, I was struck by the eerie silence. The kind that makes your own breath sound thunderous in your ears. The furniture was draped in old sheets, and the photographs that lined the walls were faded and yellowed, but oddly untouched. Every once in a while, I would glance at them, seeing familiar faces frozen in moments of joy or solemnity. The eyes. In those photographs, though, those were what unsettled me the most. I thought it was just my imagination at first, but no matter how many times I moved from room to room, I felt as though the eyes were following me. They seemed to shift subtly, flickering when I blinked or looked away as though they were alive. "Focus," I whispered to myself, adjusting my camera. I needed the perfect shots to prove I'd been here, but as I moved deeper into the house, the light began to falter. My flashlight flickered constantly, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Then I found it. The room at the very end of the hallway, locked tightly with an ancient, rusted padlock. This room was different from the others. The air felt colder, heavier, pressing against my chest. I could hear faint whispers through the door, a ghostly, sorrowful sound that made my skin crawl. I took out my camera and snapped a photo through the keyhole. The flash illuminated a small square room inside, empty, save for a single photograph resting atop a small, broken desk. It was the only object in the room, and its presence sent chills down my spine. The photograph depicted a family, smiling and dressed in formal attire, but the expressions on their faces were hauntingly vacant. Their eyes were empty, void-like. The longer I stared, the more I felt those eyes staring back at me. A noise behind me broke my concentration. I spun around, my heart racing. The hallway was still empty, but the whispers had grown louder, closer. I turned back to the photograph, attempting to take another shot, but the flash refused to work. Instead, my camera displayed an ominous message on the screen. No memory. Panic surged through me. I couldn't remove the photograph. It was embedded into the frame of the desk, its edges cracked and sealed by age. I grabbed at it, tugging hard, but it wouldn't budge. That's when I saw the outline of a figure in the shadows. Something, shifting, slowly moving through the corner of my vision. The whispers were now more distinct, their voices mourning, sorrowful. The eyes from the photographs. They weren't just watching anymore. The whispers became screams, impossibly loud, reverberating off the stone walls. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me in pitch darkness. The only sound was the unmistakable scraping of footsteps, closer now, human, yet far from natural. "Get out," a voice hissed from the darkness. It wasn't my own. It wasn't human. I bolted toward the door, fumbling in the dark, but every door and window was sealed shut. The house held me captive, its walls alive with haunting echoes. The photograph on the desk gleamed faintly, glowing with an otherworldly light as though summoning something ancient from beyond the veil. I felt a hand graze my shoulder, a cold, clammy touch, unlike anything flesh could give. My breath hitched. "Please," I whispered, choking on the fear. "Let me go." There was no reply, only the sound of the photograph shifting, the vacant eyes widening impossibly large. My camera, flickering once more, displayed one final message before shattering. Into pieces, no escape. It started as a dare. My friends and I had heard the stories about the old train station, abandoned for decades, said to be haunted. The city had shut it down after a string of mysterious disappearances, but no one really knew what happened. Curious, we decided to explore. The station stood at the edge of town, hidden behind a dense forest. We parked a few blocks away and made our way through the overgrown path. The closer we got, the heavier the air felt. The station loomed ahead, its once grand architecture now crumbling, windows shattered and graffiti scrawled across the walls. Inside, it was pitch dark. Our flashlights flickered as we moved through the empty hallways, the sound of our footsteps, echoing unnaturally. The silence was oppressive, broken only by distant creaks and the occasional sound of something shifting deeper in the shadows. As we ventured further, something felt off. The atmosphere wasn't just eerie, it was wrong. My friend Tom kept glancing over his shoulder, his face pale, while Rachel's breathing quickened with every passing second. "Let's head back," Rachel whispered. But Tom shook his head. "No, we need to see what's in the back." Reluctantly, we followed him down a hallway that seemed never-ending. The longer we walked, the colder it became. My breath came out in visible clouds, and the flickering lights gave way to complete darkness several times, forcing us to pause and regroup. Suddenly, we stopped in front of a door. Its frame was rusted beyond recognition, and the handle had long been removed. There was something written on the door, scratched into the wood with sharp nails. "You shouldn't be here." "What the hell?" Tom muttered, stepping back. Rachel turned to leave, but I hesitated. Something tugged at me, pulling me toward the door. I pulled out my phone's flashlight and shone it on the writing. "Look," I said, motioning to the message. "It's probably just some graffiti," Tom said, though his voice had lost its usual confidence. But as I examined it closer, I saw something. Faint, shifting letters beneath the surface, beneath the scratches. They didn't belong there, and they weren't visible to the naked eye. "Leave, leave, leave. We need to go," Rachel repeated, her voice shaking harder this time. Suddenly, there was a low, guttural sound behind the door, a deep, inhuman breath that felt like it vibrated through the wood. We froze, our breath coming faster. I tried the door handle again, but it wouldn't budge. "I think we need to break it down," Tom said, taking a deep breath. Before we could react, the door suddenly swung open on its own. The hallway behind it was darker than the void, a deep, consuming black that seemed alive. I couldn't see the walls, the floor, or the ceiling, just blackness, pulsing with an unseen force. A whisper followed us into the darkness. A voice, low, unintelligible, murmuring something that felt like it seeped into my very bones. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything we could understand. "Run!" I screamed, pushing past Rachel and Tom. We sprinted down the hall, the whisper still trailing behind us like a nightmare. Our flashlights flickered out one by one. We were plunged into complete darkness. I could hear Rachel's sobs, and Tom was yelling for us to find a way out. But nothing seemed real anymore. The walls shifted, the floor beneath us buckled, and shapes moved in the shadows, whispering, watching. And then I saw it. A figure standing at the end of the hallway. It had no face, no features, just darkness, a void that seemed to stretch endlessly. The whisper grew louder, the air colder until I couldn't breathe. I don't remember how we got out, but we did, crawling through an old maintenance room, pushing open a rusted service door into the night. We stumbled out, gasping for breath, our bodies trembling. The station behind us was silent once more, but I knew it was still there. "What the hell was that?" Tom shouted, gripping his knees. Rachel was crying quietly, unable to speak, and me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from within the shadows of that abandoned station, even now, long after we escaped. We moved into the house during the summer. It wasn't anything special, a modest home with chipped paint and a narrow, overgrown yard. Nothing unusual stood out at first, beyond the quiet that settled over the neighborhood. It was peaceful, a bit too peaceful. From the very first night, things felt wrong. The house settled into a silence that was unsettling. No creaks from the floorboards, no rustling of branches against the windows. It was as though the house itself held its breath. At first, we dismissed it. Old houses have their quirks, right? Maybe it was just the wind, or maybe we were just adjusting to the quiet after moving in. But the feeling never went away. The strange occurrences started subtly. Our daughter, Sophie, would wake up screaming in the middle of the night. She claimed that someone was standing at the foot of her bed. Always a shadowy figure, never fully there, just a presence. Every time we checked, nothing was there. Her nights became restless, and soon she wouldn't sleep at all without the bedroom door wide open. One evening, we heard a faint, hollow sound coming from the walls. It sounded like whispers, low and distorted, as though a dozen voices were trying to speak at once, but only half-formed. We thought perhaps it was the house settling further into its old age. The realtor said it hadn't been lived in for years before we bought it. But the whispers never faded. They came and went unpredictably, sometimes late at night, sometimes during the day when the house should have been still. Sometimes it sounded like faint laughter, soft, high-pitched, inhuman, and it sent chills down our spines. Then the visions began. I'd see it standing in the corner of rooms, a figure barely discernible in the shadows, always watching, always near but never moving. The more I focused on it, the blurrier it became, like the smoke swirling in the corners of my vision. It was like it didn't want to be fully seen, but it still wanted us to know it was there. One evening, my husband, James, went into the basement to grab a tool. He was down there for what felt like hours before I finally went down to check on him. When I found him, his face was pale, his body frozen. He stared at the far wall, his mouth trembling as though trying to speak, but no sound came out. "What's wrong?" I asked, shaking him gently. Finally, he managed to whisper, "The eyes. They're watching me." I didn't see what he saw, but I felt it, an oppressive, suffocating presence. The whispers had grown louder, and the figure was closer. After that, things escalated quickly. Sophie refused to enter her room alone, her little hands clutching at ours tightly, her tiny voice begging for us to stay with her. Objects would move on their own, the television turning on at odd hours, cupboards slamming shut when no one was near. But the worst part was the feeling. A cold, hollow breath on the back of our necks when we were alone in the house. One night, I woke up to a loud thud from downstairs. I was about to call out, thinking it was just James, but the silence that followed was unlike any sound I'd ever heard. It was as if the house itself had swallowed the noise. I hurried down to check, but no lights worked, no matter how many. Switches I flipped. The only sound was the whispers, insistent now, louder, more desperate, and then I saw it. The figure stood in the living room. Its features were clearer now, grotesque, almost human, but twisted. Skin stretched unnaturally, tight over its bones, empty sockets where the eyes should be, its mouth gaping in an expressionless scream. It didn't move, yet I could feel its presence press against every inch of the room. I didn't scream. I couldn't. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to tear my gaze away from the monstrosity in front of me. When James woke up and found me trembling, by the doorframe, he couldn't see it. Not at first. I couldn't explain what I had seen, not fully. But when he entered the room, the whispers rose again. Louder, angry, demanding. The figure moved closer. That night we gathered Sophie in, the hallway, away from her room. We didn't dare sleep in the house anymore. We spent the rest of the night huddled in the car, not knowing what to do, too terrified to return inside. The next day, we left the house behind. We didn't touch anything, no clothes, no belongings. We simply left it all, retreating back to a rental with no windows into the past. The whispers still haunt us, sometimes when we're alone, sometimes in dreams. The figure isn't gone. It lingers, a dark stain we can't wash away. We've tried to move forward, but we know it's not over, not entirely. The house is quiet now, empty, forgotten by the world. But we know we're not the only ones who feel its pull. And we dread the day someone else steps into that house because we know the whispers will return. And so will the figure, waiting to make itself seen again. It was supposed to be a simple job. I'd been hired to take care of a woman's elderly uncle, Mr. Mallory, for the weekend. The family had gone out of town and they wanted someone to check on him, keep him company, and make sure he took his medication. He lived alone in a sprawling old mansion that had been in his family for generations, perched on a cliffside overlooking the ocean. The place was remote, isolated, the kind of house you'd expect to see in horror movies. I didn't mind. I needed the money. Mr. Mallory was pleasant enough, slow-moving, frail, but with a sharp mind. He lived in the parlor most of the time, sitting by the window and staring out at the sea. He'd occasionally speak to me, but most of the time, he preferred the silence. It was eerie, but I chalked it up to his age. The first evening, after dinner, he asked me to close the heavy curtains in the parlor. It was getting dark, and he didn't like the view of the ocean at night. "Too many things out there," he muttered cryptically, his hand shaking as he handed me the curtain rope. I thought little of it. It was just a man's preference. I finished, closing the curtains, and the room seemed to shrink in the dim light, making it feel even more isolated. Mr. Mallory had retreated to his chair, staring vacantly at the floor. "Don't mind the house, dear," he said without looking up. "It has its secrets, and some of them are still here." I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I brushed it off. Old people often said strange things. The night passed uneventfully, though I found it difficult to sleep in the house. The wind howled outside, and the sound of creaking floorboards in the halls kept me on edge. At around 2 a.m., I was awoken by a noise, a soft scraping sound coming from downstairs. I held my breath. It came again, louder this time. A faint dragging, like something heavy moving across the floor. I hesitated, but decided to investigate. I tiptoed down the dark staircase, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. As I reached the bottom, the noise stopped. My flashlight flickered as I shone it into the hallway. Nothing. Just empty rooms, their doors ajar. I took a few cautious steps forward. Then I saw it. A shadow. barely visible, moving from one room to the next at the far end of the hallway. I froze. The shadow didn't belong to anyone I knew. It was too tall, too thin, and it moved with an unnatural fluidity. I called out, "Hello, Mr. Mallory?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't even seem to hear me. Slowly, I crept closer, my heart hammering in my chest. Suddenly, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, nearly dropping the flashlight. Mr. Mallory stood there, his face pale, eyes wide with terror. "Don't follow it," he whispered, his voice shaking. "It's been watching me for years." Before I could ask what he meant, the shadow moved again, disappearing into one of the rooms. I felt the blood drain from my face. I turned to Mr. Mallory. "Who is it? What is that thing?" His voice cracked. "You don't want to know. Stay upstairs. Stay out of its reach. It's waiting." I didn't need to be told twice. I rushed back up to the parlor, locking the door behind me. My pulse was racing, and my hands were clammy. What was that thing? Why didn't Mr. Mallory seem shocked? The night dragged on in silence. The next morning, Mr. Mallory seemed calm, almost normal. He was sitting in his chair again, staring out the window at the churning sea. I wanted to ask him more about last night, but he simply looked at me and said, "You don't want to know." When the family returned later that afternoon, everything seemed fine, too fine. The house was silent, the air still. They were surprised to find Mr. Mallory in good spirits, talking about the weather. Nothing unusual. I mentioned the strange occurrences, but they dismissed it with a laugh. "He's getting on in years," they said. "Sometimes his mind plays tricks on him." But I wasn't convinced. As I left the house that evening, I glanced back at the dark windows of the mansion, and there, at the top floor, I saw it. A shadow. A figure standing perfectly still, staring down at me. Its face was pale, twisted, empty, just like Mr. Mallory had described. I couldn't explain what it was, but as I drove away, I realized the terrifying truth. The figure in the window hadn't been watching Mr. Mallory all these years. It had been watching me. It was a rare invitation, one that didn't come often. An old friend's beach house, far from the busy city, offered to us for the weekend. The house was tucked away along the edge of a cliff, overlooking the vast, endless ocean. There were no neighbors, no nearby towns, just the house and the sea. We were the only ones for miles. At first glance, the house seemed idyllic. Whitewashed walls, weathered wooden beams, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the crashing waves below. It was a place made for quiet escapes, the kind of serenity that draws you in. But something felt off. The ocean was beautiful, sure, but there was an unnatural stillness to it. No seagulls, no crashing waves, just a quiet, eerie roar that seemed to echo endlessly. We chalked it up to being far from any usual signs of life, but that gnawing feeling didn't leave. On the first night, things began to shift. We sat by the fire, the sound of the ocean roaring below like a constant reminder that we were isolated. At first, it was subtle, the sound of footsteps on the deck, soft, almost imperceptible. We ignored it, assuming the wind was playing tricks on us, but the wind never sounded like that. "Just the house settling," Ryan said. Emma and I nodded in agreement, but there was an edge to his voice, a flicker of doubt we couldn't ignore. By the second night, the footsteps grew louder, more distinct. We couldn't ignore them anymore. They were slow, deliberate, circling the house like something was inspecting us. When we would rush to the windows, the deck below was empty. Nothing but the waves crashing far below. "Could be an animal," Emma suggested. But animals don't walk in that way. Calm and measured. Whatever it wasn't outside. That's when the whispers began. Soft at first, as if they were carried in on the wind, but as the night wore on, they became clearer. Not just whispering, but a voice. A deep, hollow voice that seemed to echo inside my head. Go away. I looked around the room, but neither Ryan nor Emma had heard it, or at least they wouldn't admit to it. It's nothing, Ryan said again, his voice uneasy. Just the ocean. But it wasn't. The voice came back, clearer this time, stronger. Leave. I could feel it in my bones. Something was in the house with us. Something that didn't want us there. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper that came from nowhere, kept us awake. It felt like the house itself was alive, watching us, waiting for the right moment. At dawn, I woke to a cold, oppressive silence. The kind of silence that makes you hold your breath, waiting for something to break it. I wandered to the windows, hoping for a glimpse of the ocean, but instead my eyes fell on something far worse. Standing just beyond the window, I saw a figure, tall, shadowy, its shape distorted by the mist and the morning fog. It didn't move, didn't blink, didn't seem to breathe. It just stared, its hollow eyes locked on me. I couldn't scream. I couldn't look away. It felt like time had stopped. Then, slowly, it raised one hand and waved, just once. I didn't wait for it to do anything else. I bolted from the room, heart racing, finding Ryan and Emma in the living room, staring at the same window. It's here, I gasped. It's still here. Their eyes were wide, but neither of them spoke. We didn't need to. We all knew what we had seen. The whispers came again, louder now. This time, we couldn't ignore them. Leave now, panic set in. We grabbed our things, not daring to stay another moment. The house felt alive, like it was holding us there against our will. As we stepped outside, the figure was gone. The ocean roared louder than ever, as if it too had been waiting for us to leave. We've never been back to that house. The whispers still haunt me, and sometimes when I'm by the sea, I can still feel the weight of that stare. Whatever was there, it's still waiting. It started with a simple invitation, a remote retreat in the mountains. My friend Sam had stumbled upon an old, secluded villa nestled high in the peaks. The idea was to escape the noise of the city, unwind in a place untouched by modern life. Sam had promised us peace, solitude, and breathtaking views. The villa was hidden away, accessible only via a winding, treacherous road that spiraled up the mountainside. When we finally reached the top, the place looked as though it had been forgotten by time. The grand structure was centuries old, its faded exterior barely visible through the thick fog that had rolled in. Large, ivy-covered windows glared like hollow eyes, watching as we approached. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. The furniture was old and moth-eaten, and cobwebs clung to every corner. There were no modern amenities, no Wi-Fi, no cell signal. It felt like we had stepped into a different era entirely. But we brushed it off, thinking of it as part of the charm. That night, as we sat around the fireplace, the silence became oppressive. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the occasional gust of wind outside. It was peaceful at first, but then something changed. We started hearing faint whispers, soft murmurs carried by the wind. They were too quiet to make out, but they seemed to be coming from the hallways, from behind the closed doors. Each time we opened a door to investigate, there was nothing but emptiness. We joked that it was just the old house settling, but the whispering only grew louder. At first, it was easy to dismiss. Maybe our minds were playing tricks on us. But the next night, the whispers became more distinct. They weren't just murmurs. They were voices, muffled, distorted, like they were speaking a language we couldn't understand. The voices seemed to come from every direction, sometimes whispering in unison, other times fragmented and disjointed. Sam went to bed early, exhausted. From the long drive, leaving me and Emma to stay up by the fire, we tried to ignore the unsettling sound, but it was impossible. The whispers filled the entire house, echoing through the hallways. I swear I could feel them breathing down my neck, Then, at some point, the whispers changed. They began speaking, my name. Soft, almost loving, the way someone might whisper to a child in the dark. I froze, the chill of fear racing up my spine. Emma heard it too, her face pale and trembling as she clung to my arm. We moved closer to each other, but the voices grew louder. Not just my name, but others. Names I didn't recognize. They seemed to be coming from the other side of a door, at the end of the hall, the only door that remained locked. "Do you hear that?" Emma whispered, her voice shaking. I nodded, my heart thudding in my chest. The whispers didn't stop. They echoed endlessly until we couldn't ignore them anymore. Finally, driven by a mixture of terror and morbid curiosity, I approached the door. My hand trembled as I placed it on the knob, turned it slowly, and pushed. The door creaked open, revealing a staircase that descended into darkness. The whispers came from below. They seemed to beckon us, urging us to follow. My legs felt frozen, but Emma grabbed my hand and tugged me forward. We couldn't fight the pull. As we descended, the air grew colder. The whispers became clearer, more insistent. I could now make out fragments. "Come to us," they whispered. "We've been waiting." At the bottom, we found ourselves in a long, dimly lit corridor. The walls were lined with portraits, faces with hollow eyes that seemed to follow us as we walked. The whispers grew louder, more desperate. Suddenly, the corridor opened up into a vast, ancient hall. It was like something out of a nightmare. Rows of long wooden tables covered in rotting food and dust. At the far end, we saw figures seated in shadows, their faces hidden beneath hoods. They didn't move, but the whispers seemed to come from them, filling the room like a chorus. The moment we stepped into the hall, the whispers ceased. The air grew still, suffocating. The figures remained seated, their heads bowed. We stood there frozen, unsure of what to do. Then, one by one, they raised their heads, their hollow eyes fixed on us. In that instant, I knew. The whispers had been them, waiting. The last thing I saw were those empty, lifeless eyes staring straight at me as we ran back up the stairs, the whispers echoing once more behind us. We made it out of the villa, but we didn't speak of what we saw. The memories haunt us still, the echoes of those whispers following us wherever we go. Something followed us from that place, something that remains in the shadows, waiting, always waiting. The summer evening was warm, the kind of heat that lingers even as the sun dips below the horizon. We decided to go on a hike that day, something none of us had done in a while. There were 5 of us, old friends, eager to reconnect and enjoy the fresh air. The trail led us deep into the woods, far from any signs of civilization. The trees loomed overhead, their thick canopies blocking most of the sunlight, leaving the forest in a perpetual shade. It was peaceful, almost too quiet. The only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath our boots and the occasional rustling of branches. We hadn't seen another person since we parked the car hours ago. The isolation felt serene, almost perfect. But something felt off. It wasn't, until we were several miles into the hike that I noticed it. The trees started feeling closer together, the trail growing narrower. It wasn't just the forest pressing in. The atmosphere felt heavier, like something was watching us from the shadows. I brushed it off at first. Maybe the isolation was starting to get to me. But then, one by one, the others began to notice it too. The silence wasn't just peaceful anymore, it was oppressive. My friend Sarah stopped suddenly, turning to the rest of us with wide eyes. "Do you feel that?" she asked, her voice trembling. We all nodded, uneasy now. The air felt colder, the trees rustling more erratically. It was as if the forest had taken on a life of its own. My other friend, Jack, pulled out his phone, checking for signal, but there was nothing. Not even a faint bar. "Let's keep going," I suggested, trying to stay calm. But deep down, I knew we shouldn't have. As we pressed forward, the forest seemed to tighten its grip. The trail became harder to follow, winding, deeper into the unknown. The trees grew taller, their branches reaching out like clawed fingers. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, something that didn't belong in the woods. It was when we came to a clearing that things took a darker turn. The trees around us seemed to hum with an unnatural energy, their shadows shifting in ways that defied the laws of light. In the center of the clearing was an old, weathered wooden bench, completely out of place. The air felt even colder now, and I could see my breath in front of me, though it wasn't that cold. "Let's sit for a minute," someone suggested, and we all hesitated but agreed. The bench creaked as we sat down, its splinters digging into my legs. It felt ancient, like it had been there long before any of us. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, something out of the corner of my eye. But when I turned, I saw it more clearly. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, cloaked in shadows. I couldn't make out any features, only the impression of something tall and gaunt. "Who's there?" Jack called out, his voice cracking. But there was no response. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching. "Guys, we need to go," Sarah said, panic creeping into her voice. The rest of us didn't argue. We grabbed our things and started walking quickly, keeping our eyes fixed ahead, but the feeling of being followed didn't leave. The figure was still there, always just out of reach. Every time we looked back, it seemed closer, as though it was always trailing us. We didn't stop again, even as night began to fall. The forest grew darker, but the figure stayed with us, a constant, silent presence. Eventually, we stumbled out of the woods, back to the car. We didn't speak much on the drive home, each of us lost in our thoughts. It wasn't until the next day that I looked back at the photos I took on the hike. One picture caught my attention: the clearing, the old bench, and in the background, faint and distorted, was that figure. Its eyes were the only thing visible, hollow and empty, staring back at me. It was late August when my friends and I decided to take a spontaneous trip to the old lake house. No one had used it in years, but the idea of a weekend by the water sounded perfect. The house sat far from any main roads, surrounded by thick woods on all sides. It felt like stepping into another world. The first day was peaceful, swimming in the lake, lounging by the dock, and grilling dinner as the sun set. It was everything we'd hoped for, a welcome break from the chaos of everyday life. But as night fell, something felt off. The house had a strange, musty smell, like it hadn't been properly aired out for years. We lit some candles and spread out, determined to make the most of the time we had. But the quiet grew oppressive. There wasn't a single sound other than the gentle lapping of the water. At around midnight, I decided to check the back porch. I felt restless, like something wasn't right. I stepped outside, the wooden planks creaking beneath my feet. The only thing I could hear was the faint rustling of leaves in the trees. Then I noticed something strange. There was a figure standing by the water, perfectly still. I squinted, trying to make out what it was, but there was nothing. No face, no movement, just a shadow blending with the darkness. I turned back, telling myself it was probably just my imagination. But as I stepped inside, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I told my friends about the figure the next morning, but they brushed it off as tired eyes or the shadows playing tricks on me. The second night, we stayed up late by the fire, sharing stories and laughing. But around 2 a.m., I woke up, once again feeling uneasy. The air felt heavier, the silence more oppressive. I lay there staring at the ceiling until I heard it, the faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the porch. I held my breath, frozen in place. The steps came closer, then stopped. I could hear someone, or something, standing just outside the door. My heart pounded and I waited, counting the seconds that felt like hours. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I crept to the window and peeked outside. There was nothing. No sign of anyone or anything. The porch was empty. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, the sound of those footsteps lingering in my mind. The next morning, I decided to walk down to the lake, hoping some fresh air would clear my head. The others stayed behind, still groggy from the night before. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I kept turning around, expecting to see someone or something, but there was nothing. The woods felt darker, quieter than before. When I reached the edge of the water, I decided to take a seat. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the water. It was peaceful again until I looked down. There, on the sandy shore, were footprints, but they weren't mine. They were bare, but far too large. They led into the water, vanishing beneath the surface. I backed away, my pulse racing. I didn't know how, but something had followed me. My legs trembled as I made my way back to the house, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach. When I got there, my friends were still asleep. I didn't tell them what I saw. I couldn't explain it. But even now, every time I hear the rustling of leaves or the creak of wood, I wonder if something is still waiting for me by that lake. I didn't believe in ghosts or anything beyond what my eyes could see. Not until that night. It was just a normal evening when my friends and I decided to go hiking. We had heard about a hidden trail deep in the nearby forest, far from any roads or signs of civilization. The air was crisp, the trees towered above us, their shadows stretching long and eerie as we followed the winding path. It was supposed to be a quiet escape, a peaceful night beneath the stars. The trail was narrow, barely more than a dirt path with thick forest on either side. The sunlight dimmed fast, leaving only the soft glow from our flashlights to guide us. We didn't talk much, just walking, listening to the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional rustle in the bushes. It was when we reached a clearing that things started to feel wrong. The atmosphere shifted. The forest was no longer the familiar, welcoming place it once was. The trees seemed taller, their branches forming a canopy that seemed to trap the light, casting deep shadows. The air grew colder, like the forest itself was holding its breath. We decided to set up camp there, thinking it was a good place to rest. But the longer we stayed, the more uneasy I became. The silence was deafening, as though the forest was holding its breath. I glanced around, trying to shake the feeling of being watched, but the woods felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. That's when I heard it. A faint, distant whisper. A voice, barely audible, carried on the wind. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. "Did you hear that?" I asked my friends, but they shook their heads, too preoccupied with setting up the tents. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. But as night fell, the whispers grew louder, weaving through the trees like they were calling to me. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on me, the darkness growing thicker. Then, in the stillness, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing. A shadow, taller than any tree, motionless. I couldn't make out its features, just a black silhouette, watching us. My heart pounded, and I called out to my friends, but they didn't see it. I took a step toward the figure, compelled despite the fear gripping me. As I drew closer, I noticed something strange. The figure didn't cast a shadow. The very ground beneath it seemed to bend around the shape, as though the light avoided it. It wasn't human. It was more like a void, a gap in reality. My legs felt weak, but I couldn't look away. I was frozen, watching as the figure tilted, its head almost as if acknowledging my presence. Then the whispers became a voice, calm but cold. "You shouldn't be here." I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The figure took a slow step forward, and I took a step back, realizing there was no escape. The whispers turned to screams in my head, but still, I couldn't move. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished. The forest returned to its usual silence, but something had shifted. The unease lingered, heavier now, almost suffocating. My friends, oblivious to what had just happened, continued setting up camp, blissfully unaware. I never told them about the figure, about the whispers that still echo in my mind, and I never went back to those woods. To this day, I wonder if whatever I saw is still waiting. My cousin and I used to explore the fields behind our grandparents' old farmhouse every summer. The place was vast, with acres of corn and wheat, a rickety barn that seemed like it might collapse any day, and a patch of woods that everyone in the family avoided. Grandpa always said it wasn't safe. Snakes, sinkholes, or some vague story about trespassers, we never believed him. This summer, curiosity got the better of us. On a lazy afternoon, after Grandma fell asleep on the porch, we grabbed flashlights and decided to explore the woods. It wasn't a planned adventure, just a spur-of-the-moment thing. The air was cooler under the canopy of trees, the thick smell of moss and earth surrounding us. The deeper we went, the more the sounds of the farm disappeared. No wind rustling, the corn, no birds. It felt like stepping into another world. My cousin, always braver than me, joked about finding hidden treasure or an old cabin full of relics. We didn't find treasure. What we found was something else. About half a mile into the woods, we stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood a strange structure, a stone well covered with moss and half crumbling, like it had been there for centuries. But what was odd wasn't the well itself. It was the carvings on the stones around it. Strange symbols and spirals, etched deep into the surface, uneven like they'd been scratched in with trembling hands. My cousin leaned over the edge of the well, shining his flashlight down. I expected to see water or maybe just darkness. Instead, there was a dull shimmer, like something metallic reflecting light far below. He whispered something, but I wasn't paying attention. My eyes were fixed on one of the symbols on the well's rim, a crude, jagged spiral. It felt alive, almost pulsing under the flashlight beam. Then we heard it, a voice. It wasn't a shout or a whisper, but something low and guttural, echoing faintly from deep inside the well. My cousin stumbled back, dropping his flashlight into the pit. The light flickered as it tumbled down, illuminating the sides of the well as it fell. For a moment, I thought I saw something move, a shadow curling along the stone. I grabbed his arm, whispering that we needed to leave, but he just stood there, staring at the well, his mouth slightly open. When I shook him, he finally snapped out of it, muttering, "Did you hear it? It said my name." I didn't want to argue, I just wanted to get out of there. I pulled him away, and we hurried back through the woods, tripping over roots and branches. The air felt heavier now, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer. By the time we reached the edge of the trees, we were both gasping for breath. We didn't tell anyone about the well. Not that day, not that summer. But things changed after that. My cousin started sleepwalking, which he'd never done before. He'd wake up outside, standing at the edge of the cornfield, always facing the woods. One night, he woke me up, standing by my bed with a blank expression, saying he needed to go back. I tried to convince him it was just a dream, that the well wasn't real, or, if it was, that it didn't mean anything. But he was adamant. He said it was calling him, that it wasn't finished with us. The last straw came on the final night of the summer. We were packing up to leave the farm when I heard the screen door slam. My cousin was gone. I ran outside, shouting his name, but there was no answer. Grandma and Grandpa were asleep, so I grabbed a flashlight and ran toward the woods. I found him in the clearing, standing next to the well. He wasn't moving, just staring down into the darkness. When I called his name, he didn't respond. I ran to him, grabbed his arm, and shined my flashlight into the well. What I saw still makes my skin crawl. The shimmer from before was gone. Instead, there was something climbing up the walls, something with too many limbs, its skin slick and glistening like oil. Its face wasn't a face at all, just a mass of sharp, twisting shapes. I screamed, pulling my cousin away. As we stumbled back, the well went silent again, and the clearing felt empty, lifeless. He finally looked at me, his face pale, and said, "It knows us now." We never spoke about it after that night. The woods were off limits for the rest of the summer, and the next year the farm was sold. But every so often, when I close my eyes, I see that thing climbing toward us, and I hear its voice, low, guttural, and unmistakably calling my name. I'll never forget the day I visited that old bookstore. It was tucked away on a quiet street, surrounded by tall, crumbling brick buildings that leaned toward one another as though the city had forgotten about them. The windows of the bookstore were dusty and covered in fog, but something about it drew me in. It wasn't the kind of place people normally wandered into, but I found myself stepping through the creaking wooden door without hesitation. The bell above rang faintly, and the smell of old paper and dust hit me all at once. The place felt as though it had been untouched for decades. Bookshelves stretched high above my head, the spines old and faded. The light from the single bulb overhead flickered weakly. I wandered through the narrow aisles, trailing my fingers along the spines of the forgotten books, half expecting to hear the whispers of some long-lost ghostly stories. I picked up a few, old paperbacks, flipping through pages that crinkled in my hands. Something about the silence and the musty air felt almost otherworldly. I lost track of time, losing myself in the thick atmosphere of the store. At the end of one aisle, I found a shelf that seemed different from the rest. The books here were thinner, almost like pamphlets, their covers dark and worn. I pulled one from the shelf. Its title was barely legible, Whispers of the Forgotten. It wasn't the title that caught my attention, though. It was the strange sense of familiarity I felt as I opened it. The first few pages were scattered with strange symbols and text I couldn't read. I traced my fingers over them, my mind drawn to the obscure illustrations, twisted, distorted shapes that looked like they were from another world. I turned to the next page, and that's when I saw it. Words written in a language that wasn't English. They weren't letters, just strange symbols that sent a shiver down my spine. I couldn't stop reading, as though something was compelling me to continue. My hands trembled as I read the first few lines. "Those who seek will find, but they may not return." The words sent a cold wave through my body. I glanced around the bookstore, suddenly realizing how quiet it had become. The faint creak of the floorboards seemed to echo louder than it should have, and I could feel eyes on me. It was as though the store itself was watching, waiting. The room seemed darker now, shadows stretching toward me from the corners of the shelves. My heart raced as I looked back at the book. The pages turned by themselves, landing on a chapter that spoke of places that no longer existed. Forgotten towns, cities swallowed by time and silence. The more I read, the more I felt an odd connection to these places. It was as if I had been there before, even though I knew I hadn't. Suddenly, the light overhead flickered violently, casting everything into near darkness. A chill swept through the room, and I heard a whisper, so faint I could barely make it out. "Turn back." I froze, the whisper echoing in my ears. My eyes darted around the bookstore, but there was no one there. My breath came in shallow gasps, as I realized I was alone. The pages of the book flipped again, this time stopping on a section titled The Forgotten Path. My hands were shaking as I read, "The path is long and lonely, but those who seek will find. Beware, for what is lost may never be reclaimed." The room felt colder now, and I could hear the sound of footsteps, though no one was there. The air was thick, and it felt as though something was closing in on me. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, my mind consumed by the words of the book. It was then that I noticed something at the edge of my vision. A figure, tall, shadowy, and indistinct, stood at the end of the aisle, watching me. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its presence. It wasn't human, not in the way I knew. The whisper came again, clearer this time. Return. What is lost? Panic set in, and I knew I had to get out. I stumbled backward, clutching the book tightly. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze following me as I hurried toward the door. As I ran out of the bookstore, the bell above rang once more, echoing into the night. I didn't look back. The streets outside were empty, silent, as though the city had swallowed the bookstore whole. I don't know what I brought with me from that place, but every night since I've dreamed of the figures and the whispers. There's a piece of that book still in my hands, and I wonder, will I ever be able to forget, or will I be drawn back seeking something I might not want to find? It was supposed to be a simple day at the beach, the kind where the sun beats down, the sound of waves is constant, and nothing seems out of place. My friends and I decided to take a trip to a secluded beach we'd heard about, far from the crowded tourist spots. We packed coolers, sunscreen, and our usual beach gear, eager for some peace and quiet. The beach was vast, rocky, and stretched out for miles. It felt like we were the only ones there, which was exactly what we'd wanted. We spent the day lounging, swimming, and talking. The water was refreshing, the sand soft beneath our feet, and the sense of isolation only added to the charm of the place. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the rocks, we decided to stay a little longer, hoping to watch the sun dip below the horizon. The air was warm and thick, but something about the silence unsettled me. It wasn't just the absence of other people. There was something else, something in the atmosphere that felt wrong. As the sun disappeared, the sky turned a deep purple and the horizon shimmered with orange streaks. We were packing our things when one of my friends, Lisa, stopped and pointed toward the edge of the beach. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice quieter than before. We all turned. Standing at the far end of the beach, barely visible in the fading light, was a figure. It was tall and thin, cloaked in darkness, its outline blending with the shadows of the cliffs. At first, we thought it might be someone hiking the cliffs, but they weren't moving. They stood there, motionless, watching us. "Maybe it's someone camping," one of my other friends suggested. But there weren't any campsites around, just endless rocks and cliffs stretching into the distance. We watched for what felt like forever, but the figure didn't move. It was like a statue, unmoving and silent. A chill ran down my spine. The more we stared, the more I felt like it was staring back at us, like we were the ones being watched. Lisa started to take a step forward, her curiosity overpowering her fear. "We should check," she said softly. "Maybe it's just someone lost." I wanted to argue, to tell her to stay put, but the silence and stillness of the figure were too eerie. We followed her, our steps hesitant on the uneven rocks. The closer we got, the more details we could make out. It wasn't human. It didn't have a face, at least, not in the way we expected. Its head was hollow, like an empty mask, and its limbs were too long and thin, twisted at unnatural angles. "Let's get back," I urged, my voice shaking. But before we could turn, the figure began to move. Slowly, methodically, like it was gliding rather than walking. "Run!" I shouted, my fear overcoming me. But before any of us could, the figure had closed the distance between us. Its hand, if you could call it that, reached out, long and bony, and touched Lisa's shoulder. Her scream echoed across the empty beach, but it wasn't the scream of someone in terror. It was hollow, lifeless. I didn't stop running until I was far away, back at the edge of the beach, gasping for breath. My friends followed, but Lisa wasn't with them. I turned back once, but she was gone. That night, as we sat huddled in silence, I couldn't stop thinking about Lisa. The figure, whatever it was, had taken her. I knew we'd never find her again. And as I stared at the dark horizon, I knew that we weren't the only ones left watching. It was supposed to be a relaxing trip. A few friends and I decided to escape the city and spend a weekend camping at a secluded lake in the mountains. None of us had been there before, but we'd heard it was quiet, beautiful, and perfect for getting away from the noise of the world. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun sinking low behind the trees as we parked our cars by the edge of the lake. The water was calm, its surface reflecting the pale light of dusk like a mirror. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. For a moment, everything felt perfect. We set up our tents, gathered wood for a fire, and cooked dinner. The laughter and conversation filled the space, muffled by the stillness of the woods. It was everything we had hoped for: peaceful, remote, and disconnected from the chaos of daily life. As night fell, we gathered around the fire, watching the flames flicker and listening to the quiet crackling. The stars appeared, one by one, stretching out into the endless dark sky. The lake reflected them, making it seem as though we were surrounded by an ocean of light. But it wasn't the beauty that started to unsettle me. It was the silence. No wind rustled the trees. No insects chirped, just the crackling fire and the faint sound of water lapping at the shore. It was too quiet, unnatural. I glanced around at my friends who were deep in conversation, unaware of the strange stillness. "I'm going to get some water," one of them finally said, breaking the silence. "Sure," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant. "I'll come with." We made our way to the edge of the lake, our footsteps silent on the soft earth. The water was cold and still, reflecting the dark shapes of the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, waiting. "Hey," I whispered to my friend. "Do you feel that?" He stopped, looking at me, his face pale under the starlight. "Yeah, something's not right." We stood there for a moment, our eyes scanning the darkness beyond the trees. There was no movement, no sound, just the stillness. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A faint shimmer, like something just beneath the surface of the water. A reflection that wasn't quite right. I turned toward it, heart racing, and saw a figure. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. Its form was indistinct, almost fluid, as though it was made of the water itself. It stared at us with hollow eyes, its face obscured by the darkness. I grabbed my friend's arm, my voice trembling. "We need to get back." We ran. Our footsteps thundered in my ears as we sprinted back to the campsite. The trees loomed over us, their branches creaking as if they were watching us too. The fire was still burning, casting flickering shadows on my friends' faces, but none of them seemed to notice our panic. That night, I couldn't sleep. The silence that had once felt peaceful now felt suffocating. I kept hearing whispers in the dark, and every time I closed my eyes I saw the figure, those hollow, watching eyes beneath the water. At dawn, I gathered my friends and told them what had happened. They didn't believe me. They dismissed it as nerves, as the strange atmosphere of the woods playing tricks on my mind. But I knew better. The figure was still out there, waiting beneath the surface of the lake, and I could still feel those hollow eyes watching me, even now. It was just another ordinary Saturday, or at least I thought it would be. I decided to spend the day exploring the old, forgotten part of town that no one really visited anymore. The streets were lined with buildings that had long since fallen into disrepair, their facades cracked and faded from years of neglect. Nobody seemed to come here anymore, which was exactly why I wanted to see it. I wandered aimlessly, the silence enveloping me like a thick, oppressive fog. The air smelled stale, full of dust and decay. Most of the windows in the buildings were shattered, letting in the muted light of the day that barely managed to penetrate the grime. There was an unsettling stillness, a quiet that felt almost alive. I tried to push away the creeping sense of discomfort, reminding myself that it was just an old part of town. Nothing more. As I walked, I came across an old bookstore, its window cracked and its door hanging loosely on one hinge. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped inside. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of old paper and mildew. Dust covered every surface and cobwebs stretched from the corners of the ceiling. The place was like a museum, untouched by time. I wandered between the shelves, the weight of the silence pressing on my shoulders. The only sound was the soft shuffle of my footsteps on the creaking floorboards. Every so often, I'd hear a faint creak or the distant echo of my own breathing, but that was all. It felt like I had stepped into a world that had long since forgotten life. Suddenly, something shifted in the shadows. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. A whispering sound echoed through the empty space, quiet and subtle. I turned around, my heart pounding, but there was nothing, just more rows of old, dusty books. "Hello." My voice sounded hollow, swallowed by the silence. No response. I took a cautious step forward, my flashlight flickering as I moved deeper into the store. The whispering came again, louder this time, like a breath on the back of my neck. My flashlight flickered again, and for a split second I thought I saw something move, a shadow at the end of the aisle. I followed the beam of light, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. The store was filled with rows upon rows of books, each one older than the last. The whispering continued, low and haunting, as if it were coming from the depths of the building itself. I walked toward the back of the store, my footsteps echoing in the quiet. The whispers grew louder, now more like faint murmurs, as though something was speaking to me in a language I couldn't understand. My pulse quickened as I realized the sound wasn't coming from a book, or the wind, or anything tangible. Then I saw it. A figure, faint, barely visible in the dim light. It stood near the far wall, its form indistinct, almost transparent. My breath hitched, and my flashlight flickered once more, casting shadows that danced along the walls. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching. The whispers grew louder, merging into a chorus of faint, distorted voices. I took a hesitant step toward it, my hand shaking as I tried to focus my flashlight. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence returned, more oppressive than before. The figure vanished, as if it had never been there. My chest tightened as I searched the darkness, but there was nothing. The store felt colder now, empty in a way that felt almost unnatural. I decided to leave. I didn't care about the books anymore, or the eerie feeling that had taken over the space. I just wanted to get out. As I made my way to the front door, I could feel eyes watching me, following me. My footsteps quickened, the creaking floorboards beneath me sounding louder than they had all day. When I finally reached the door, I paused, one last glance over my shoulder, just to be sure I was alone. That's when I saw it. The figure again, just beyond the doorway, standing in the shadows. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I felt as though it could see straight through me. Then it was gone. I stepped outside, the door slamming shut behind me. The whispering was gone, replaced by silence once more. I didn't look back. I never went back to that bookstore, and I never will. Some places leave scars that can't be erased. It was late October, the sky heavy with overcast clouds as we set off for a camping trip. My friends and I had been planning this trip for months, far away from the city, deep into the heart of a forest we'd never visited before. None of us had ever camped out this far from civilization, but the promise of quiet, untouched wilderness was too tempting. We arrived at the site in the late afternoon, the air crisp and carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves. The campground was abandoned with no signs of other campers. The silence stretched out around us, broken only by the distant rustling of trees and the soft crunch of leaves beneath our feet. As we unpacked and set up our tents, the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the trees. By the time night fell, we had a small fire going, the flickering light casting dancing shadows on the ground. The forest stretched out before us, dark and vast, and the only sounds were the occasional creak of branches and the distant hoot of an owl. We sat around the fire, sharing stories, laughing, and drinking. The tension from the city life seemed to melt away as we relaxed under the canopy of stars. But even in the quiet, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The forest seemed too still, too quiet. It wasn't just peaceful, it was eerily quiet. Around midnight, I decided to check the area beyond our campsite. Something about the woods felt off, as though they were holding their breath. I grabbed a flashlight and ventured a little further into the trees. The ground was soft and uneven beneath my feet, and the only light came from my flashlight's dim beam. I walked for what felt like hours, the trees towering above me, their branches twisting into the darkness. The deeper I went, the stronger the feeling that I was being watched. My heartbeat quickened and I stopped, shining the light around. There was nothing but trees, shadows, and the faint creak of the wind. But then I saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible figure in the distance. It wasn't human. It was tall and slender, standing motionless. My breath hitched, and I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off it. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, unmoving. I turned and ran back to camp, my legs carrying me as fast as they could. When I returned, my friends were asleep, blissfully unaware of the presence I had felt. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the memory of that figure stayed with me. The next morning, we packed up quickly and decided to head back to civilization. None of us spoke about what I had seen. I was too afraid they wouldn't believe me. As we walked back, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure again, but the forest was silent, as though it had never been disturbed. Even now, years later, I wonder what it was I saw that night. Whatever it was, I know I wasn't alone in the forest. I was driving home late after finishing a long day at the plant. The road was empty, winding through hills and fields that stretched on for miles. It was one of those stretches where there's nothing but darkness, just you and the headlights cutting through the night. I preferred it that way. No distractions, no noise, just the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. It had been a rough shift. The plant was always loud, always hot, but tonight felt different. A strange feeling had been hanging over me all day, a low, persistent unease that I couldn't shake. I kept thinking about the strange, flickering shadows that danced on the walls of the machinery room and the echoing creaks I heard whenever I moved too far away from the others. I tried not to let it get to me, but something wasn't right. The radio crackled again and I turned it down, the silence of the night settling in once more. As I drove, I noticed how still everything was. Even the usual hum of insects seemed to have disappeared. It wasn't just quiet, it was wrong. The kind of silence that makes you feel like something is waiting just beyond the edge of your vision. I passed through a stretch of trees, their branches hanging low, creating dark tunnels over the road. I glanced into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. The mirror reflected only my car and the empty road behind me. As I came around a bend, the headlights caught something strange ahead. It wasn't a roadblock or an animal. It was a figure, standing motionless by the side of the road, wearing a long coat that blended into the night. My heart stopped for a moment. I didn't recognize the figure, and the fact that it was just standing there, perfectly still, made my stomach churn. I slowed down, my mind racing. Who would be out here at this hour? The figure didn't move, didn't flinch as my headlights illuminated it. I couldn't see any facial features, just a vague, shadowy form beneath the coat. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I couldn't bring myself to stop, but I slowed down, creeping past the figure. It never moved, never flinched as I passed by. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, and my pulse throbbed in my ears. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, but the figure remained still. A mile down the road, I dared to look back again. The figure was gone. I didn't stop driving until I hit the city limits. The whole ride home, I kept replaying what I'd seen. It didn't make sense. Who, or what, stood there, unmoving, in the middle of nowhere? When I finally got home, I locked the door and turned on every light in the house, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something had been watching me, waiting for me to pass. I never went back to that road again. I don't think I ever will. A friend suggested we drive out to the old factory, located deep in the woods. The place had been abandoned for decades, they said, left to rot after the industry moved elsewhere. No one had been there in years, and the idea of exploring an eerie, forgotten space seemed too intriguing to resist. We set off early in the afternoon, 3 of us packed into an old sedan. The drive was long, winding through narrow, overgrown roads until we finally reached the outskirts of the factory. From the outside, it looked like a relic of another time. Tall, weathered brick walls covered in ivy, windows shattered and empty. The once mighty structure loomed over us, silent and still. We parked the car, and as we approached, a shiver ran down my spine. The place felt abandoned, sure, but not empty. There was a palpable sense of something watching, something that had never truly left. Inside, the factory was a maze of metal and decay. Broken machinery stood rusted and still, large gears covered in dust. The air smelled stale, and the silence was oppressive. We wandered through the empty halls, shining our flashlights on walls covered in graffiti, peeling paint, and remnants of what once was. At first, there wasn't much to see, just shadows stretching across the floor, the occasional creak of the old wooden beams above. But as we moved deeper into the building, things began to feel wrong. It wasn't the faint echoes of our footsteps on the concrete floor, or the way the dust seemed to hang in the air like a living thing. It was the feeling that we weren't alone. I don't know how to describe it, but it wasn't fear in the usual sense. More like an overwhelming sense of presence, something watching, following us. We kept moving, dismissing the feeling as overactive imaginations, but my heart wouldn't stop racing. We reached what had once been the main hall, a vast expanse of cracked tiles and broken machinery. At the far end, partially hidden by a stack of debris, was a staircase leading to what looked like the second floor. We made our way towards it, stepping carefully through the clutter of fallen pipes and rusted metal. That's when we heard it. A low, faint groan, like metal twisting under pressure. We froze. It wasn't coming from the floor above, it was below. My stomach sank as I realized it was coming from the basement. The noise was distant, almost mechanical, but it felt wrong. I was about to suggest we leave when one of my friends, Jason, walked toward the staircase. His flashlight beam flickered, casting strange shadows across the walls as he climbed. The sound continued, growing louder now, as if whatever made it was approaching. "Come on," Jason called back, his voice echoing unnaturally. "Let's see what's down there." I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. The others followed Jason down the creaking staircase, leaving me behind, my nerves frayed. I clutched my flashlight tighter, scanning the space. The noise had grown deafening now. Something was down there, something heavy. When I reached the bottom, the scene before me made my breath catch. The basement was larger than I'd expected, filled with old machinery and storage crates. But what stood out were the deep, claw-like scratches etched into the floor, running from one end to the other. It was like something had dragged itself across the concrete, leaving long, deep marks behind. I tried to tell myself it was just decay, but the noises had stopped. The silence was now deafening. We all stood there, staring at the marks, when one of my friends let out a gasp. I followed his gaze, and there, in the far corner of the basement, was something I'll never forget. A figure, a tall, pale figure with hollow eyes, barely discernible in the dim light. It was partially obscured by shadows, its features indistinct, but I could feel its gaze, cold and empty, locked onto us. "No," I whispered, taking a step back. "Let's go." But Jason was already moving toward it. His flashlight illuminated the figure, and for a moment we all stood frozen, unable to look away. Suddenly, the figure spoke, not with words, but with a low, inhuman hum that seemed to reverberate through my entire body. It wasn't a voice so much as a presence, pressing down on us, suffocating us. "We need to leave," one of my friends finally said, his voice trembling. We didn't wait for a second invitation. We fled up the staircase, the sound of the figure's hum fading behind us. My legs felt like jelly as we burst out into the cool night air, gasping for breath. As we drove away, I glanced back in the rearview mirror, expecting to see nothing but the darkness of the forest. But there, standing at the edge of the factory, was the figure. It didn't move, just stood there, watching us as we drove away. We never spoke about it again. But I know what I saw that night wasn't something from this world. Whatever that thing was, it's still out there, waiting. I never thought a simple evening trip to the beach could turn into something so terrifying. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a quick getaway with a few friends. Just a drive down to the coast, a few hours of quiet by the water, and the calm of the waves lapping against the shore. We arrived around sunset, the sky a canvas of deep oranges and purples. The beach was nearly empty, save for a few other couples and a group of friends setting up a fire further down. The air was crisp but not cold, the sound of the waves a soothing backdrop. My friends and I found a spot near the water, spread out our blanket, and cracked open a few beers. It was perfect, peaceful, relaxing. We talked about nothing important, watching the horizon as the sun dipped lower into the sea. It was when the sky went dark that things started to feel off. The first clue came when I noticed the distant glow of a single flashlight, bobbing up and down as if someone were walking toward us along the shore. I didn't think much of it at first, maybe someone out for a late-night stroll. But then I noticed the way the light kept moving erratically, as if they couldn't decide where they were going. "Hey, does anyone else see that?" I asked, pointing toward the light. My friends followed my gaze, squinting into the darkness. "Probably just someone lost," one of them shrugged, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The closer the light got, the more it seemed to flicker, as though whoever was carrying it couldn't see what they were doing. It bobbed and darted erratically, weaving along the water's edge like something lost at sea. Then, suddenly, the light disappeared. I was about to dismiss it when a low, guttural moan carried over the sound of the waves. My friends froze, glancing around. "What was that?" someone whispered. We all strained our ears, searching the darkness. The moan came again, this time louder, more distinct. It didn't sound human, more like a creature, something primal and unsettling. The moans echoed between the cliffs, bouncing across the empty beach. "Let's get out of here," someone said, their voice trembling. We grabbed our stuff and started walking back toward the car, the unease growing with every step. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something in the darkness, but there was nothing, just the endless stretch of black beach stretching before us. It wasn't until we reached the car that the second clue hit me. My phone buzzed. No service. Not a single bar. The town was only about 20 minutes away, and usually we'd have signal. But now, nothing. My friends and I exchanged uneasy glances as we climbed into the car. The air inside felt heavy, oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As I drove, I kept glancing into the rearview mirror. The beach was behind us, just darkness now, but I still felt like something was there, something following us. That's when I saw it, barely visible in the dim glow of the headlights. A figure, tall, thin, and hunched over, walking in the opposite direction from us, toward the shore. I slammed on the brakes, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who the hell is that?" one of my friends whispered, staring in shock at the figure. I couldn't answer. The figure didn't look human. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as though it were studying us from afar. And that flashlight, it wasn't being held properly. It bobbed erratically as if whoever was holding it couldn't see straight. The figure moved closer to the water's edge, fading in and out of the darkness, then stopped. It stood there, motionless, staring in our direction. My friends and I didn't wait to find out what it was. I hit the gas, tires squealing as we raced back toward town. The whole way, I kept glancing back, expecting to see the figure chasing us. But it was gone. When we got to the edge of town, I pulled over, gasping for air. The tension was still there, but nothing followed us. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had watched us, waited, and we had been too blind to notice. We've never spoken of that night again. It started with a simple trip. Me and a few friends decided to rent a small lake house, nestled deep in the woods. We were looking for a peaceful weekend away from the noise of city life. The house was old, wooden, surrounded by towering pines and the quiet hum of nature. We thought it would be perfect. Serene, isolated, and far from any distractions. The first night was calm. We unpacked, had a few drinks, and sat by the fire. The lake, reflecting the full moon, seemed endless and still. The wind whispered through the trees, and I could almost feel the tension from the city melt away. It felt too quiet, though, unnervingly so. But we brushed it off, telling ourselves it was just the stillness of the woods at night. It was around midnight when I woke. I'd drifted off in one of the old wooden chairs by the window. Something stirred in my dream. I sat up and rubbed my eyes. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the room was cast in darkness. That's when I heard it. Soft tapping. I assumed it was rain, but the sky was clear. The sound came again. Light, but deliberate, like something was trying to get my attention. I turned my head toward the window, listening, expecting to see raindrops. But there was nothing there. I waited, my breath shallow, listening for whatever could be making the noise. Then, through the corner of my eye, I saw something move. Not a shadow, not a figure. It was a shape, indistinct, something that seemed out of place. I froze. My heart pounded as I scanned the dark outline of the woods outside. The trees seemed to stretch endlessly, their tops swaying in the wind. Whatever was there wasn't a part of the forest. It felt like it didn't belong. I got up slowly, every step creaking on the old wooden floor. The tapping continued, but now it wasn't just at the window. It was all around the house, soft, rhythmic, almost musical. I peered out again, my eyes straining into the night. There, in the distance, I saw it, just for a second. A figure, not human, not quite. It was tall, thin, and it moved strangely, almost like a distorted reflection of something. I stumbled backward, my hand gripping the wall. My mind raced. Was it a trick of the light? Was I imagining things? But the fear was too real. Something wasn't right. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I wanted to call out to my friends, but my voice wouldn't work. The air felt colder, like something had seeped into the house. Then I heard it, the voice. Soft, almost a whisper, but it carried through the room like it was right next to me. "Come outside." It wasn't coming from anywhere in the house. It was outside. The chill in my bones deepened. I felt like I was frozen, rooted to the floor. I wanted to scream, but all I could do was listen. The door creaked open on its own, I didn't remember leaving it unlocked. The figure I had seen before was now closer, just beyond the porch. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching the house. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My legs felt like stone. The whisper came again, sharper this time. "Let me in." I blinked, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. The figure took a step closer. It was unnatural. Wrong. Its skin was pale and stretched too thin, and its limbs moved like they weren't quite attached to its body. Panic surged through me. I forced myself to turn and sprint toward my friend's rooms. The taps on the window started again, louder, as if they were chasing me. I could feel something behind me, something that wanted to get in. I burst into their room, screaming, and dragged them from their beds. They were groggy at first, but the fear in my voice made them realize something wasn't right. We rushed out the back door, not daring to look back. The figure never followed us. We left the cabin behind, not stopping until we reached the edge of the woods where we could no longer see the house. It wasn't until hours later, as we sat in a diner miles from where we started, that I finally spoke. "I think we were followed," I said, my voice trembling. "I think something was waiting for us. None of us wanted to go back. None of us ever did." I was in the middle of a road trip driving through endless stretches of desert. The sun had set hours ago, and now it was just me and the empty highway. There wasn't a single car in sight, nothing but the faint glow of my headlights illuminating the cracked asphalt ahead. I wasn't sure how far I'd gone. I had been driving for what felt like forever, searching for the next gas station or even a small town, but the road seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions, disappearing into the horizon like a thin line against the sky. My phone had lost signal hours ago, and the only sound in the car was the steady hum of the engine. I was starting to feel uneasy. Everything about this trip had felt off since the moment I left. The air was dry and still, not a whisper of wind or even the faintest rustle of leaves. It was as if the desert itself was holding its breath. I didn't want to stop, but I had no choice. The low fuel light blinked on, warning me that I needed to find something soon. My eyes searched the horizon, hoping for a sign of life, a flicker of light, anything. But the desert was vast and empty, stretching out in all directions. After what felt like hours of driving, I finally saw something. In the distance, a faint glow of light, maybe a gas station or a motel. I couldn't tell which from this far away. But hope surged through me, and I pushed my foot down harder on the gas pedal. As I got closer, the light became clearer. It wasn't a gas station or a motel. It was a building, old and crumbling, its walls covered in cracked paint. A small, flickering sign hung above the entrance, barely legible in the fading light. It read, "The Oasis." My stomach twisted. It looked abandoned, forgotten. But at this point, I didn't care. I needed fuel, water, something, anything to keep going. I parked my car in front of the building and stepped out, the heat still radiating off the pavement. The air smelled dry and dusty, the kind of scent that clings to your throat. The front door creaked open as I pushed it. Inside, it was dimly lit by a few bare bulbs dangling from the ceiling. The shelves were empty, covered in a thick layer of dust. The coolers were all shut, ice long melted. It felt more like a ghost town than a place meant to serve travelers. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding hollow in the silence. No reply. I moved through the aisles, hoping to find a supply of water or something to drink. But there was nothing. The only sound was my footsteps echoing against the cracked tile floor. It was eerie. The silence felt oppressive, as if the desert had swallowed up everything, leaving only this empty space behind. I made my way to the back of the store, where an old counter sat, covered in cobwebs. A small radio sat there, its antenna bent, dust coating its surface. I picked it up, hoping maybe I could get some signal, but static hissed from the speaker. Nothing but dead air. Desperation started to set in. I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 2 a.m. I had no idea how far I was from anything. I was isolated, completely alone in this vast, empty desert. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It echoed from the direction of the front door. I froze, listening intently. The tapping continued, soft, deliberate, steady. It wasn't the wind. It didn't sound like something natural. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. I crept toward the front, my heart hammering in my chest. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't coming from outside, but somewhere inside the building. I couldn't tell where exactly. It sounded like it was right in front of me, but there was nothing there. I turned to look back at the counter, and that's when I saw it. A dark shape standing behind the glass. It wasn't human. It had no distinct features, just a shadowy, distorted form. It was watching me. I could feel its eyes, though I didn't know how that was possible. My breath hitched as I stepped back, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It moved closer, slow, deliberate. I could hear its footsteps, even though they shouldn't have made a sound on the dust-covered floor. I bolted for the door, fear clouding my vision. The creaking footsteps followed me, closer now, as though it was right behind me. I threw open the door and sprinted into the night, the cold air hitting me like a slap in the face. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I was miles down the road, the building a distant blur behind me. My car waited, humming quietly, the only sound I could hear. I never went back. I don't know what I saw that night or if it was even real, but sometimes, when I drive through the desert, I wonder if I'll see that building again, or if something else will come for me. It was supposed to be a quiet evening out, just me and a few friends. We decided to explore an old abandoned theater that had been shut down for decades. The place was a relic, decaying with its crumbling facade and faded marquee. The theater had always been known for its eerie history, rumors of strange occurrences, unexplained disappearances, and whispers of something lurking in the shadows. We weren't expecting much beyond a few creepy sights and maybe some unsettling stories to tell afterward. It wasn't far from town, but far enough that no one really ventured there anymore. The building was dark, with broken windows and faded paint. The sign above the entrance flickered intermittently, creating fleeting glimpses of the name Riverview Theater. We stepped inside, the smell of decay hitting us immediately. Dust hung thick in the air, and the old red velvet seats were tattered and stained. The theater was massive, with a grand stage still intact, though the paint was peeling, revealing layers of once vibrant murals beneath. As we wandered deeper into the building, there was a strange silence. The creaks of the old floorboards echoed around us, amplifying every step we took. The air felt cold, unnatural. I shivered and glanced around, wondering if we'd come too far into a place that wasn't supposed to be disturbed. That's when things started getting strange. We found ourselves in what remained of the lobby. The front doors had long been boarded up, but there was a door behind the counter, leading to the projection room. My friends and I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of us. I led the way, opening the door slowly. Inside was a long hallway lit by dim, flickering bulbs. The walls were lined with faded, yellowing posters of long-forgotten movies. As we moved down the hall, the floor creaked beneath our feet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The projection room at the end of the hall was locked. The old rusted door refused to budge no matter how much we pushed. I pulled out my phone to get a better look, and that's when I saw the graffiti etched into the wall. "We're watching you." My blood ran cold, and I realized that whoever wrote that wasn't kidding. I turned around, and that's when I noticed something. A figure, just a faint silhouette, standing at the back of the theater. It was obscured by the shadows, but its presence sent a wave of fear crashing over me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew better. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it in the direction of the figure. The light danced across the shadows, revealing nothing. the figure had vanished. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No response. We decided it was time to leave. Fast. But as we made our way back to the lobby, the door behind us slammed shut, cutting us off from the exit. Panic set in as we tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The sound of our breathing echoed in the empty theater, growing louder with every passing second. Suddenly, we heard a noise from above, the creaking of footsteps, slow, deliberate. My flashlight caught a glimpse of movement on the balcony. I froze, shining the beam up toward the second level. A figure stood there, staring down at us. This time, there was no mistaking it. The figure had no face, just an empty void where the eyes should have been. Its silhouette seemed to blur, shifting and stretching in a way that was unnatural. "Run!" I shouted. We bolted toward the main entrance, tripping over ourselves in our haste. The air seemed to grow colder with each passing second. The door, however, was still sealed shut. In desperation, I turned back to the balcony, expecting to see the figure again. Instead, I saw something far worse. It wasn't a figure at all. It was a screen, glowing faintly. But the screen wasn't showing any movie. It was showing us. There we were, standing at the front of the theater, faces frozen in horror. But something was wrong. Our reflections weren't acting like we were. The shadows, the empty eyes, they weren't reflections at all. They were watching us, mimicking us. I could barely comprehend what I was seeing when the screen went dark. The theater was plunged into total darkness, except for the faint glow of my phone. My friends and I managed to break free from the building somehow, sprinting into the night, not stopping until we reached the edge of town. The old theater remained behind us, a broken, silent shell under the pale moonlight. We never spoke of what we saw that night, and we never went back. My friends and I had been planning a hiking trip for weeks, a chance to escape the city and immerse ourselves in the quiet, untouched beauty of the mountains. We were tired of screens and the constant noise of everyday life. This would be our chance to disconnect and recharge. The trailhead was only about an hour's drive from town, and we arrived just as the sun was beginning to set. The air was crisp, and the towering pines stretched endlessly in every direction. The trail was well worn, though not overly crowded. It was perfect. As we started the hike, the conversations flowed, and we basked in the sounds of nature, the crunch of gravel beneath our feet, the soft rustling of leaves, and the distant call of birds. We decided to set up camp a few miles in, beside a stream that meandered through the forest. The spot felt isolated and peaceful, exactly what we were looking for. As we set up our tents and built a fire, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ground. That's when it started. At first, it was subtle, a faint rustling in the underbrush. I figured it was just some wildlife, maybe a deer or a squirrel. But as the evening deepened, the sounds grew more distinct. It wasn't just the rustling anymore. There were footsteps. Quiet at first, but steady, following us. I stopped and turned around, expecting to see one of my friends. But no one was there. The woods were still except for the distant hum of insects. I didn't say anything to the others. I didn't want to worry them, but my nerves were already fraying. Every step we took, I felt like we were being watched. The sounds of the forest, which had been so comforting earlier, now felt oppressive. It wasn't just wildlife out there anymore. By the time we made it to camp, the shadows had grown long and deep. The fire we built crackled loudly, and we huddled close, trying to keep warm. I kept my eyes on the tree line, expecting to see someone emerge, but nothing ever came. It wasn't until later, after we had settled in, that I noticed something strange. The footsteps, whatever was following us, they had stopped. The forest was silent once again, but it wasn't a comforting silence. It felt wrong, hollow, as though something had vanished. I woke up a few hours later, shivering. The fire had burned down to a few glowing embers, but the night was still warm. I stepped out of my tent, hoping some fresh air would calm me. As I stood there, looking at the quiet trees, I noticed something bizarre. The usual sounds of the night, the rustling of leaves, the distant chirp of crickets, were gone. The forest was completely still. Then I heard it, a soft, uneven breathing. It was coming from the woods, just beyond the tree line. My blood ran cold. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was rooted in place, unable to tear my eyes away from the dark. The breathing grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't human, that much was clear. It was shallow, labored, almost as if whatever was out there was struggling to draw air. The sound wasn't far from where we had camped, but the direction was unclear. I felt like whatever was out there was looking for us, and now that it had found us, it was circling closer. A chill ran down my spine as I realized something. Those footsteps earlier, they weren't just following us. They were guiding something toward us, toward the camp. I could feel the presence growing closer. My mind raced with thoughts. Should I wake my friends? But what could I tell them? I didn't want to put them in more danger than they already were. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the woods, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. For a moment, there was nothing, just the endless shadows and the faint rustling of leaves. And then I saw it. A figure. Tall, obscured by darkness but unmistakable. Its form wasn't human. It seemed wrong, like something twisted and unnatural. It stared at me from the edge of the trees, unmoving, its hollow eyes glinting in the faint light of my flashlight. My heart thudded in my chest as I stared back, frozen in place. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure took a step forward, and I could see now, the uneven, staggering gait as if it wasn't fully human. The outline of its face was blurred, almost as if it wasn't meant to be seen. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished into the woods. The breathing stopped. The silence returned. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. My friends never woke up. By dawn, I convinced myself that whatever it was gone. I woke them and told them we needed to leave, that I wasn't feeling well. None of them questioned it. We hiked out of the forest, and I've never gone back. I've tried to convince myself it was just fear and exhaustion, that I imagined everything. But even now, I can't forget those hollow eyes, staring from the darkness. Whatever it was, I don't believe we were alone that night. It was an ordinary day, or so I thought. My family had decided to spend the weekend at a nearby lake, a place we used to visit years ago when I was a child. I remember the crisp air, the sound of the water gently lapping at the shore, and the quiet seclusion. It was the perfect escape from the chaos of everyday life. We arrived in the late afternoon, the sun sinking low in the sky. My parents unpacked the car while my siblings and I ran toward the water. The familiar smell of pine and damp earth filled the air, and for a while everything felt calm and peaceful. We fished off the dock, laughed, and swam in the cool, clear water. As the sun began to set, we decided to set up camp near the lake. My dad had brought a tent, and we found a spot far from the main area surrounded by thick trees. The fire crackled softly, and we roasted marshmallows and shared stories. It was exactly what we needed, a break from the noise and stress. Around midnight, my parents decided it was time to turn in. I stayed by the fire, wanting to soak in the stillness of the night for just a little longer. The firelight flickered against the trees, casting long shadows. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of the water and the occasional rustle of leaves. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, I was awake and shivering. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, leaving only faint traces of warmth. The forest around me was silent, but there was something off. I sat up, stretching my arms. The air felt colder than before, and there was a strange stillness, like the whole world had stopped breathing. I glanced at the tree line, expecting to see the familiar shape of the tent, but it was gone. In its place was only darkness. At first, I thought maybe my family had gone for a walk or stepped away from the camp, but something didn't feel right. I called out their names, my voice swallowed by the stillness. No response. I stood up, my heart hammering. The night was pitch black, with only the faint glow of the stars to guide me. My breath fogged in the cold air, and the oppressive silence wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. I tried to stay calm, telling myself they were just nearby, maybe searching for firewood or exploring. I made my way toward the tree line, stepping cautiously over the uneven ground. The woods seemed endless, the trees towering above me, their branches twisting in strange, unnatural shapes. The silence grew louder with every step I took. It wasn't until I stumbled across something that I stopped cold. A trail of small bare footprints in the dirt. They were tiny, almost childlike, but there were no children in our group. I followed them for a few steps before the unease turned to terror. The footprints led away from our camp toward the deeper parts of the forest. "Mom? Dad? Sam? Emma?" I called again, my voice breaking. My knees felt weak as I followed the trail, the strange prints leading me further into the trees. The silence was deafening, and every creak of the branches overhead seemed like it was drawing closer. Finally, I stumbled upon something, a faint light, not from the stars or the moon, but from a source deeper in the woods. It flickered like a distant candle. My stomach sank as I moved closer, my pulse quickening. What I found made my skin crawl. A clearing opened up ahead, and there, in the middle of it, was a figure standing perfectly still. It was cloaked in shadows, its features obscured by the darkness, but I could feel its presence, like something ancient and otherworldly. I froze, unable to look away. The figure didn't move, didn't react, but I could feel its gaze upon me. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. Suddenly, the figure tilted its head as if examining me. A sharp, dry crack echoed through the forest as it took a slow step forward. I could hear my breath, shallow and ragged, as I watched in silent horror. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the figure was gone. The light flickered once more and vanished into the darkness. Tears blurred my vision as I turned and ran. The forest seemed endless, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to get back to the camp, back to some sense of safety. I didn't stop until I could see the faint glow of the remaining embers from the fire. When I got there, I found my family. They were unharmed, asleep in the tent as if nothing had happened. They had no memory of waking up in the middle of the night, no memory of wandering into the woods, as if time had folded and they hadn't been touched by whatever had stalked me. To this day, I don't know what I saw, what followed me through those woods. All I know is that I haven't returned to that place. The memories still haunt me, and every time I hear the sound of silence, I'm reminded of that night, when something far beyond explanation walked in the shadows.